Sometimes a mystery is simply an unanswered question, but more often, it's the silence after the answers run out. The world is full of events that remain unexplained because they were ignored or misrecorded. There's no fantasy in these stories, only a reality no one wanted to look too closely at. In this collection of 72 unsolved mysteries, we'll explore topics that others prefer to keep quiet about, but we don't. So subscribe if you want to know more than we're told. Phantom Ship Jenny. In the early autumn of 1840, the English whaling ship Hope was moving through the icy waters of the South Atlantic when a black dot appeared ahead in the fog, a bark frozen in the ice. She didn't respond to signals, she didn't maneuver, she didn't drift. She just stood there, as if waiting. The captain of the Hope decided to approach. The ship was completely frozen, motionless, but visually fine. The name painted on the stern read, Jenny, London. None of the crew knew her. When they boarded, everything looked wrong. The deck was silent. No destruction, no chaos, no signs of struggle. Just a deathly silence soaked into the canvas. The men lay in their places, one at the wheel, two in the cabin, covered with blankets. One of the officers would later write in his log, "They didn't look dead. They looked frozen in the moment." The main thing found on board was the captain's log. The last entry was dated May 17th, 1823. The Jenny had 17 years of silence behind her. The captain wrote that the ship was trapped in the ice in the Drake Passage. He described attempts to escape. Then the cold, death, and loneliness. His final sentence, "God, have mercy on us. Not a single one remains." How the ship had drifted across the Southern Ocean for so many years, without a trace of destruction, without completely sinking, no one could explain. Even less clear was how the bodies had been preserved, without decay, without distortion. It was as if the ice itself had decided to preserve the memory. After this, the Jenny vanished from history just as she had appeared. The ship was neither towed nor recorded in maritime registers. Official British archives contain no mention of her. Only scattered newspaper reports in Hamburg, London, and Chile, and references to letters never seen again. Some historians consider this a fabrication, but almost everyone who has studied the matter in depth agrees on one thing. This is not an urban legend. It is history that was left untouched. The question isn't where Jenny was drifting. The question is why she ended up somewhere other than where she was supposed to disappear. She didn't return. She was brought back. Human pillars in the Aokigahara forest. At the foot of Mount Fuji, among damp, mossy rocks and densely intertwined roots, lies a forest the Japanese call Jukai, the Sea of Trees. Tourists know it as Aokigahara. Guides warn, it's too quiet there. You lose your bearings there. The compass doesn't work. But the strangest discoveries begin not on the surface but in the depths. Since the 1980s, forestry officials have been recording abnormally dense patches of woody growths in certain areas, resembling protruding cylinders. They rise from the ground vertically, have a uniform diameter, and a smooth texture. They appear to be charred wood covered in porous bark. However, laboratory analysis reveals that these structures contain bones. These aren't ordinary burials. The pillars don't rot. They don't shatter when cut. The remains inside are often incomplete, fragmentary, sometimes just a skull, sometimes just a pelvis or ribs, but not a single specimen showed signs of burial. And strangest of all, many of them date back to different decades. In one case, a pathologist found bone fragments in the sample with signs of radiation exposure typical of nuclear accidents. In another, he found a dental filling identifier, used only in the 1950s. But the pillar itself is young, according to biologists, approximately 20 years old. The discrepancy between the ages of the bodies and the wood raises unanswered questions. One Forestry Service employee who worked in Aokigahara for almost 30 years recounted how, in some places, the poles grow in a circle. Inside, it's empty. No mushrooms, no grass, no trash. Only silence. There's no sound of birds or wind. There, he said, you can feel the attention. There's a theory that the forest recycles the dead. Not metaphorically, but literally. It transforms remains into arboreal forms, not as a parasite, but as a memory. Local monks advise against disturbing these places, not out of superstition, but because interfering with the structure could be perceived not as a mistake, but as an insult. No one knows exactly what's happening deep within Aokigahara. Neither geologists nor ecologists nor historians have come up with a convincing explanation. Perhaps it's a process. Perhaps it's punishment. Or perhaps it's a way to prevent those who retreated into the forest from disappearing, but didn't want to be forgotten. The Curse of the Pharaohs. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he had no idea that within months his team would find itself at the center of one of the most famous historical myths of the 20th century. The first to die was Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor. He died suddenly from blood poisoning caused by a mosquito bite. That same night, according to eyewitnesses, the power went out in Cairo. Carnarvon's dog, which was in England, allegedly began howling and soon died. This marked the beginning of what would later be called the Curse of the Pharaohs. At least 9 people directly or indirectly involved with the expedition had died by the time the tomb was opened. Some died of illness, others of accidents, and still others of unexplained causes. Documents recorded an abnormally high mortality rate among researchers and technical staff. However, Carter lived to old age and died a natural death. He didn't believe in the curse, but even he admitted there was something heavy, thick, oppressive in the tomb's atmosphere. Texts were discovered inside the tomb, later translated as warnings. One of them, engraved on a stone tablet, read, "Death on wings will overtake anyone who disturbs the king's peace." Whether by chance or not, it was the flying creatures that caused Carnarvon's illness. However, the mystery is not limited to this case. Similar waves of death have been recorded at other excavations related to ancient Egypt. In the 1970s, a team of archaeologists exploring the Abydos region also encountered a chain of deaths. 5 people died within 2 years. One of them was from a rare blood disorder that defied explanation. All the cases had one thing in common. The work involved artifacts previously recovered from tombs. Some researchers speculate that this is a biological threat: fungi, spores, mold. But none of these theories explain the selective effect. Why do some people die, while others who came into contact with the same objects survive? Why do the symptoms often differ? Why are some artifacts still being taken, even decades later? There are other explanations. Some believe it's not a curse, but a structural issue. The tombs weren't built simply for burial. They were designed as closed systems, meant to preserve not only the flesh, but also the intention. Disturbing the structure sets off a chain that can't be stopped, because it's not magical. It's architectural. Whatever the reason behind the string of deaths, the effect remains. Thousands of years later, the name Tutankhamun is known to millions. But the name of Carnarvon is far less so. Is it a curse, or simply a reminder? In Egypt, nothing ever belongs to you alone. Even if you think you found an entrance, you've only opened someone else's door, and it may have been closed for a reason. Flash mob on Reddit. In 2011, an account named A8538 appeared on Reddit. It didn't comment, didn't respond, and didn't engage in discussions. It simply published posts filled with long strings of symbols, codes that were meaningless to most users. The entries were released irregularly, without explanation. No one knew who was behind them, and everything would have remained in the shadows, if not for one fact. These symbols actually contained messages. Users began deciphering the strings. It turned out that some of them were converted English text, encrypted using a complex 64-bit system. One of the first successful decipherments contained a phrase that suggested the fate of the entire world depended on it. Later, there were fragments from the Old Testament, geographic coordinates, and even coded images. No connection was found between these fragments. They simply existed. They appeared and disappeared. But with each new publication, the feeling remained the same. This was not a random game. There was a structure. The flash mob quickly evolved into a cryptographic movement. Thousands of users attempted to construct a model explaining the logic behind the posts. Some suggested it was an artificial intelligence project. Others spoke of a government operation disguised as Reddit. The strangest theory: it's a way to transmit information disguised as chaos through an ordinary platform among ordinary posts. But then everything suddenly stopped. A8538's account suddenly went silent. The posts disappeared. The links led to nothing. Reddit administration refused to comment. Archived copies of most of the transcripts remained, but some were corrupted. Some claimed that the posts disappeared not only from the site, but also from local copies, as if their very presence was disturbing something. Amid this silence, another account appeared, with a similar nickname, but its messages were meaningless. Blank lines, repeated characters. Researchers dismissed it as an attempt at forgery, but the main point was gone. A858 never returned. Neither did the explanation. Could it have been a test? Possibly. An experiment? Probably. But with each passing year, as no information emerges, the only theory remains. It was a communication channel between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who should have understood. No one understood, or understood, but didn't say anything. All that remained were zeros, ones, and silence. And one question no one answered. If it was a joke, why haven't we forgotten it? Mysterious monument in Butter Creek. On a desolate stretch of land in Georgia, USA, near the town of Butter Creek, stood a granite monument that many called the American Stonehenge. Its official name is the Georgia Guidestones. Built in 1980. Designer unknown. The initiator was a man using the pseudonym Robert K. Christian, acting on behalf of a small group of loyal Americans. From the very beginning, this object seemed more than just strange. It seemed programmed. The monument consisted of 5 massive slabs arranged in a radial petal shape. Each side contained text engraved in 8 languages: English, Russian, Chinese, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish, and Swahili. The main message was 10 instructions to humanity. The first of them is, keep the world's population below 500 million in balance with nature. This raised questions. Why was the threshold set? Why was the wording so technical, almost devoid of emotion? And most importantly, why did the authors remain unknown even decades later? There were suggestions that this was a message for survivors of a global catastrophe, or a program for a new order, or a ritual warning encrypted as a command. The monument was oriented astronomically precisely. One of the slabs had a hole through which a sunbeam would illuminate the central axis on a certain day of the year. The installation was clearly meticulously planned, down to the last detail, from the polished granite to the astronomical alignment. There was no museum, no god, no explanatory sign nearby, only slabs, only silence. Many considered the structure a cult. Attempts were made to blow it up, desecrate it, and paint over it. In 2022, one of the slabs was indeed damaged by an explosion. A few days later, the remaining elements of the monument were completely dismantled. Officially, it was for security reasons. But this coincidence fit too neatly into the nature of the entire structure. It appeared suddenly and vanished without a trace. Never truly understood. No organization claimed responsibility for the demolition. All that remains is a concrete pad, and archival photos in which strange inscriptions speak not so much to contemporaries as to someone who will come later. Maybe we weren't supposed to read these lines. Maybe they were meant for those who remain. But then why did we see them? Why did we remember them? And who decided it was time to erase them? Cry in the mine. In the late 1980s, a group of Soviet geophysicists drilled an ultra-deep borehole in the Murmansk region near the Kola Peninsula. The project was known as the Kola Super Deep Project, an ambitious attempt to reach the lowest layers of the Earth's crust. However, in the Western press, this drilling became famous under another name, the Shaft to Hell. Officially, the drill reached a depth of over 12 kilometers, but it was at one of the deepest points that something occurred that would later be called the scream phenomenon. According to one theory, after lowering a sound recording probe into the shaft, the device began transmitting a strange signal. Not a noise, not a hum, but something resembling human voices. The recording allegedly captured an unintelligible chorus of groans, screams, and wails. The tape contained not one voice, but many. The sound was chaotic, as if coming from a vast underground space filled with torment. The story spread around the world, first airing on a Christian radio program in the United States. There it was presented as confirmation of the existence of hell, using a supposedly leaked audio recording from the scene. In response, Soviet sources denied everything. Scientists explained, no recording was made, no probe with a microphone was used, the whole thing was a fabrication. However, several former project employees later, in informal interviews, did not directly refute the rumors. They spoke evasively. They added, some of the instruments did not behave as expected. Some scientists explained the scream as an acoustic interpretation of rock movement, specific frequencies that the human brain can mistakenly perceive as speech. Others claim the entire story is a hoax. But the strange thing is how this legend lives on. The sound attributed to the mine has been copied many times, inserted into videos discussed, and each time it evokes the same reaction: instinctive fear. Even if the audio recording was fake, even if nothing was recorded, why did this story stick? Why, among thousands of scientific discoveries, did people remember this particular fragment? Not as a fact, but as a feeling. Perhaps it doesn't matter whether there was a scream. Perhaps what matters is something else. What we heard in the silence, when we peered too deep. And the question isn't what the device transmitted, but what we expected it to transmit. Psychological experiment, room 237. In 1997, an experiment was conducted at a secret research institute in Germany. It remains officially unacknowledged, but it left behind too many coincidences to be a fabrication. It was never publicly named. But documents leaked online in the early 2000s included a number, room 237. Many believe this is an allusion to the room from the film The Shining, but the connections turned out to be far less imaginary. The essence of the experiment, according to unconfirmed reports, was the creation of a completely isolated sensory chamber, devoid of sound, light, smell, and time. Inside was a room 5 by 5 meters, white walls. The temperature was set at a precise 22 degrees Celsius. The ventilation was silent. Electromagnetic interference was shielded. No clocks, no objects, only a person. A volunteer, a 36-year-old man with no psychiatric history, was asked to spend 30 hours there. The chamber was under covert video surveillance. For the first 4 hours, the subject paced, tried to talk, and stretched out the time. Then he lay down. Then he stood up. At the 7th hour, he froze. Judging by the footage, he began staring at a single point on the wall. He never looked away. The video of this moment is strangely blurry, as if the image had begun to bleed. When I tried to digitize the film again, the effect was repeated. This never happened with any other camera. At the 12th hour, the subject began to speak, but not to the camera. He spoke to someone standing in front of him. His tone was respectful. No responses were audible. He nodded several times and laughed once, but the laughter was very quiet, almost an exhalation. Then he fell silent. After the time was up, the volunteer refused to leave the room. He said, "I'm already here." Attempts to question him failed. He withdrew. He was hospitalized. 3 days later, he disappeared from the clinic. Officially, he was discharged. Unofficially, he disappeared. The experiment was never repeated. The recordings were deleted. The scientists associated with the project either left or changed their specialties. But the rumor remained, and they don't explain it. Because if you say room 237 is just an empty space, you'll ignore the main question. What if there really is someone there, but they only appear when you're alone, and you don't call, and you don't look, you just sit for a long time? Balloons from Costa Rica. In southern Costa Rica, in the Diqui Valley, amid tropical thickets and forgotten banana plantations, perfectly shaped stone spheres have been discovered for decades. They're called Diqui spheres, but no one knows for sure where they came from, who made them, or why. Some are the size of a tennis ball, others weigh up to 15 tons. Almost all are geometrically precise spheres. They were first discovered by workers from the United Fruit Company in the 1930s. While clearing land, they came across smooth stone hemispheres sunken into the ground, some in groups. Some were arranged in straight lines. Others formed perfect triangles and circles. When they tried to move one of them, a dull crack was heard underground. It was left untouched. Scientists determined that the spheres were made of gabbro, a heavy igneous rock found in southwestern Costa Rica, but far from where they were discovered. The question immediately became obvious. How were they transported? And most importantly, why? No writing, no images, no fragments of culture that could explain this phenomenon have been found in the valley. Some associate the spheres with a pre-Hispanic civilization that vanished without a trace. Others link them to astronomical patterns. There are theories that they are ritual anchors, links to celestial events. In one of the laid-out triangles, if you draw lines between the vertices, they indicate the position of the sun on the day of the vernal equinox. But this hasn't been confirmed. Some of the balls were moved or stolen. Today they stand in museums, villas, and at the gates of government buildings. The rest are lost in the ground. During one expedition in the 1970s, researchers noticed fine grooves visible on some of the spheres, as if metal threads had slid across them. But no tool marks were found, and no experiment has been able to replicate the precision and scale without the aid of modern equipment. Some believe the balls are simply decoration. Some think they're a marker, some think they're a memory. But none of the theories answer the main question. Why don't they carry any message? As if they weren't meant to be read, but to be. Without explanation, without function, without time. Just lying there. And a reminder that someone already knew what a perfect circle looked like before the circle had even been invented. The disappearance of the Yaogang family. In August 2008, in China's Yunnan province, on the outskirts of the village of Yaogang, a family of 5 disappeared. A husband, wife, 2 children, and a grandmother. There were no quarrels, no debts, no signs of violence. The house was locked from the inside. The dishes were on the table. The tea in the cups was still warm. The television continued playing a program that had started 15 minutes earlier. But no one was there, neither in the house nor around it. The first to raise the alarm was a neighbor who didn't see the children at school that morning. An hour later, the police were at the door. Everything was in its place. Passports, phones, keys, clothes. 2 cats were sleeping in the room. Neither was hungry, neither was nervous. Only one odd thing, a wet, bare footprint on the hallway carpet. Alone. No dirt, no pear. The investigation began quickly. All the village residents were questioned. No one saw anything. There was no video surveillance. Telephone operators confirmed that cell phone activity ceased at 3:24 a.m. It was as if all devices had turned off at once. No calls, no attempts to access the internet. It was as if life had simply stopped. A search of the area turned up nothing. No tracks in the forest, no strange vehicles. The house stood on a hill overlooking the river. Only one odd detail was discovered near the water, a torn piece of paper wedged between the rocks. There was no text on it, only numbers. 10 characters, which could neither be deciphered nor matched with anything. The paper disappeared from the case file 3 days later. A week later, a call came in. A child's voice whispered, "We're almost back." Then silence. The call came from a payphone that hadn't been serviced since 2006. Officially, the Yaogang family is listed as missing. No bodies, no trace. The house was sold. The new tenants tore down the walls, but found a crack under the floor. A perfectly round depression, as if the ground had subsided slightly. There was no cave, no void beneath, only stone, smooth as if polished. The disappearance was attributed to unknown circumstances, but the village still avoids the area. Sometimes closer to morning, a light comes on in the windows of the empty house. For a few seconds, no wiring, no electricity, just a light that's not connected to anything, and it comes back, as if someone is still looking for the way back. O'Hare Airport Time Portal. Chicago's O'Hare Airport is renowned as one of the world's busiest transportation hubs. Millions of passengers, thousands of flights, and 24-hour traffic. But amid all this noise, there's a nearly forgotten account of an event that still stirs controversy, and questions that remain unanswered. In the spring of 1994, an incident recorded as a temporary disappearance of an object occurred at the airport's Terminal G. At 3:42 a.m., security received a report from a technician working the night shift. Near one of the closed gates, he had discovered a man who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Appeared out. According to him, the figure materialized right before his eyes, without light, without sound. It simply became visible. The man appeared disoriented, dressed in strange clothes, a neatly pressed 1950s suit, a bow tie, and a hat. He didn't speak. He just looked around. A minute later, he was gone. This incident would have been chalked up to fatigue if not for the video. A surveillance camera installed above exit G17 captured the silhouette. The footage shows a blank area. Then there's a distortion, as if the air is vibrating. And for a moment, a person appears. Blur, light distortion, and then emptiness again. The footage was checked. No errors were found. After the internal report was published, the camera was replaced. The recording fragment disappeared from the archive 3 days later. When another employee tried to find the backup copy, the database returned an error. Synchronization failure. The only remaining trace was a technician's statement, handwritten, uncopied. The document is kept in a private collection and is said to contain details not found in the official report. A few months later, another incident occurred in the same terminal. A passenger reported seeing a man standing as if trapped inside the glass. She claimed the figure was motionless, but his face was alive and frightened. It was as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. The transparent surface didn't reflect any light. A few seconds later, everything disappeared. Researchers studying anomalous spaces later proposed a theory. Certain zones of intense electromagnetic stress can cause a local distortion of time perception, and the airport, as an intersection, can inadvertently become a transition point. This hypothesis borders on science fiction, but there are other coincidences. In 1978, a private jet pilot approaching O'Hare told the controller he saw other planes that looked old. He thought he was watching an air show, but at that moment, it was the only one in the sky, and there was nothing on the radar. It later turned out that the description of one of the planes matched a model decommissioned 30 years earlier. There are a few cases, but they repeat. The same terminal, the same time, between 3 and 4 in the morning, and always. The feeling that space is slightly out of sync with itself. As if occasionally, at just the right moment, the boundary between now and somewhere nearby opens for a few seconds. Not to let someone in, but simply because the loop has shifted. Maybe they're coincidences. Maybe they're false memories. But if one day you find yourself at O'Hare Airport in the middle of the night and suddenly feel the space around you tremble slightly, don't turn around right away, because someone might already be standing behind you. And to them, you're someone who just appeared out of nowhere. Underground cities of Cappadocia. In the heart of Turkey, in the Cappadocia region, beneath the rolling landscape of weathered cliffs, lies something far stranger than tourist postcards and colorful balloons. These are underground cities. Dozens of levels dug into the soft, tough rock, connected by passages, tunnels, and ventilated shafts. The most famous of them, Derinkuyu, descends to a depth of over 60 meters, containing living quarters, warehouses, wineries, chapels, ventilation systems, and wells. And all of this is underground. No trace of architects, no clear reason, no explanation as to why they were built at all. Official archaeology claims that the cities were used during the Byzantine period to shelter from raids, but the structure itself tells a different story. The defense mechanisms, hand-operated stone doors weighing hundreds of kilograms, secret passages, hidden branches leading to dead ends. All this looks less like a temporary shelter than a system designed for long-term survival, and perhaps not from an external enemy, but from something that couldn't be allowed in, or conversely, let out. The cities are devoid of decoration. No frescoes, no icons, almost a complete lack of symbols, as if they were built not for beauty, but for survival. Some areas seem deliberately isolated. There's only one path leading there, cut off, without ventilation, without purpose. Researchers speculate that these may have been isolation chambers, but who was put there, and why? The strangest thing is the dating. Archaeologists attribute the cities to the first millennium BC, but in older layers, traces of repeated use have been found, as if someone had already lived in these places long before the Byzantines descended. Some of the deepest passages have been filled in unnaturally, as if they were sealed from the inside. In one of the mines, they found a ceiling made of a smooth, dark stone not found in the region. It bears a notch resembling a handprint, not human in proportions. Just a notch, no comment. Locals say they still occasionally hear noises coming from some of the undiscovered tunnels. A hum, or something like breathing. Researchers attribute it to an acoustic effect, but no one goes down there alone, even today. Some theories link Cappadocia to ancient catastrophes, global events that forced civilizations underground. Others claim they are ritual spaces simulating death and rebirth. Still others argue that people didn't build these structures for themselves. They were discovered and simply used. In the 21st century, more than 90% of underground corridors remain undiscovered. Maps are incomplete. Some sections have collapsed. But the very idea that an entire city lies beneath our feet, built not according to the laws of time, but by some other principles, is haunting. Because these cities aren't dead. They're just waiting to be remembered, or needed again. And then someone will come down, not out of curiosity, but because something will start happening above ground that will force them to hide below again. Voices from radio UVB-76 at 46.5 kilohertz, somewhere between the loud silence of the airwaves and the chaotic noise of shortwave, one of the most enigmatic radio stations in history, UVB-76, has been broadcasting for decades. They call it The buzzer. Since the 1970s, it has been broadcasting the same thing, a short metallic sound, a beep, repeating at intervals of several seconds. No pauses, no meaning, no explanation. Sometimes, very rarely, the signal interrupts, and then a voice sounds. Male, clear, speaking Russian. He reads out groups of numbers, names, seemingly meaningless words. Then, the buzzing again. These transmissions occur without warning, are undecipherable, and are never repeated. No one has officially acknowledged any connection to any intelligence agency or military structure, although almost everyone assumes UVB-76 is part of an emergency backup command system. But if this is true, why has the station continued to operate for decades? Why does it remain active even when entire military communications units are transitioning to digital technology? Why does the hum continue even at night, even during political crises, government changes, and power outages? In 2010, amateur radio enthusiasts tracked the broadcast location for the first time. The source was located at an abandoned military base near the town of Povarovo in the Moscow region. A team of researchers traveled there. They discovered empty buildings, broken windows, broken equipment, and a radio station that was still operating. The same sound was emanating from the loudspeaker. 2 days later, the signal disappeared from that point and reappeared from another. Stronger, more focused. It was as if someone realized they'd been found. Some days, the buzzer broadcast is filled with strange sounds. One time they recorded a piece of classical music. Another time, a female voice uttering incoherent phrases. There were moments when the sounds of footsteps, doors slamming, and coughing were picked up. It was as if the microphone had been left on, accidentally transmitting something that shouldn't have been broadcast. Some believe UVB-76 is part of a dead hand, an automatic response system in the event of a disaster. Others believe it's an audible beacon confirming that the station is still alive. But there are also less rational theories. For example, that it's not a radio station at all. A mechanism for maintaining attention, a way of being present, a reminder of something that hasn't yet arrived, but is already marking its frequency in space. Because if one day this sound disappears, truly disappears, without warning, without replacement, many people around the world will realize something terrible has happened, even if they don't know what it was. They will simply feel the silence, and then the question will no longer be what we heard. But why did it take us so long to prepare for this? The mystery of the city of Cahokia, in what is now Illinois, just a few kilometers from St. Louis, lies one of North America's most enigmatic archaeological sites, the ancient city of Cahokia. Today, its site is covered in grass, sparse trees, and dozens of artificial earthen mounds that at first glance resemble natural elevations. But every hill is man-made, and in the center rises the largest of them, Monk's Mound. It stands about 30 meters high. It was the center of a city estimated to have housed up to 40,000 people, more than 12th century London. And yet we don't know who built it. What were the names of these people? What language they spoke? Why they disappeared? Cahokia emerged around 1050. Over the next 2 centuries, it developed at an incredible rate. Archaeologists are finding remains of streets, fortified walls, temples, and dwellings. The city center was designed with mathematical precision. Its orientation aligns with the solar cycles. It even had a calendar of sorts, consisting of enormous wooden pillars installed in a circle, which allowed for the tracking of the equinoxes and solstices. And all this, without writing, without the wheel, without metal, without a known center of power. Not a single inscription, not a single name. But the most disturbing discovery was not the city's structure, but what lay beneath it. In several hills, archaeologists discovered burials with bodies arranged in complex patterns. One contained more than 200 young women. Another pit contained bodies without arms. There were also mass burials with bones arranged in layers, as if the bodies had been dumped into the pits at intervals. Some believe these were ritual sacrifices. Others believe they are the remains of a catastrophe. But no one knows exactly what happened. Around 1350, the city began to empty. It didn't collapse. It didn't burn. It simply ceased to exist. The people left. And they didn't even leave behind legends. The indigenous tribes living in the region today say Cahokia is not their creation. They call it the land of others' ancestors. Native American cultures have a concept of the first people, those who came before them, Who built? Who knew? Who left? Some researchers suggest that Cahokia may have been the center of a culture comparable in importance to the Mayan or Sumerian civilizations. Only without writing, without stone, without a legacy. And then the main question isn't why the city disappeared, but how could an entire civilization exist at such a level and then be completely erased, as if it had never existed, as if it hadn't been written into history, as if someone had erased it, or as if it had decided to leave on its own. Hatton Garden is the perfect heist. In April 2015, what is officially being called the robbery of the century occurred in London. In the Hatton Garden district, home for decades to some of Europe's most secure bank vaults, a group of people broke into an underground vault and stole jewelry, cash, and documents worth over $200 million. But it's not the size of the theft. There were many of those. It's the details, which still don't add up to a coherent picture. According to the official version, the perpetrators were 6 men between the ages of 50 and 70. They were former burglars and former electricians, none of whom had access to modern technology. They entered the building through an elevator shaft, bypassed the security systems, disabled the alarm, and drilled through a wall more than half a meter thick into the vault. The operation lasted 2 days. No one heard. Not a single sensor was triggered. The cameras recorded only external movements. Inside, there was silence. One of the investigators later said, "This couldn't have been done without help from within." But such help was never proven. Moreover, the equipment used by the criminals was old, cumbersome, and noisy. But there's no evidence of its transport into the building. Not on camera, not in time, not in logistics. It's as if the equipment appeared on site and then disappeared. When the criminals were arrested, they were missing most of the stolen goods. The money and jewelry were gone. Of the 32 safe deposit boxes opened in the vault, most belonged to people whose names did not appear in any open financial system. Some boxes were empty. Some stored documents that shouldn't have existed. One investigator anonymously admitted that an uncensored diplomatic packet related to events in Iran in the 1980s was found in one of the lockers. It disappeared before the official inventory was made. After the trial, almost all of the participants received short sentences. They were quickly transferred to secure prisons. 2 later died of natural causes. 1 disappeared before reaching the interrogation. The one who remained silent. And everything points to this not being a robbery for money. It was a cover operation. Take something you can't look for, and pretend it was just a robbery by pensioners. And if this is true, then the whole perfect crime narrative becomes something else. Not a story about criminals, but a story about how a system can hide its mistakes under the guise of chaos, where the most reliable safe isn't concrete and an alarm system, but a story the public readily believes. A story about burglars, drills, and millions, without mentioning what exactly disappeared forever. The case of the sewn-up dead man from Australia. On December 1st, 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Beach in Adelaide. He was lying at the water's edge, neatly dressed in a suit and with shiny shoes. There were no identification or money in his pockets. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of poisoning. His appearance didn't match any of the database entries. Thus began one of the strangest cases in Australian criminal history, the mystery of the stitched-up man, later known as the Tamam Shud case. Upon examination, it was discovered that the tags on the clothing had been cut off. Fingerprints were inconclusive. The autopsy revealed no cause of death, although the organs appeared to be abnormally overloaded with blood. This suggested poisoning, but the tests revealed nothing. It was as if the man had died from lack of cause. A few days later, a tiny scrap of paper was found in his secret pocket. Printed on it was the words Tamam Shud. This is a Persian expression meaning end or completed. It was later discovered that it had been torn from the last page of a rare collection of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. When the search for the book from which the phrase had been ripped began, a man came to the police and reported finding one in his car, parked near the beach. Pencil marks in the margins contained cryptic lines, including phone numbers and a series of letters that didn't match any known code. One of the phones belonged to a nurse who lived nearby. She refused to speak. It was later revealed that she did know the man, but did not officially acknowledge him. Her behavior during interrogation was described as bordering on hysteria. The strangest thing happened later. In 2022, more than 70 years later, DNA testing revealed the man's name, Carl Webb. It seemed the mystery was solved. But the more they learned about Carl, the stranger the story became. He disappeared from all records until the moment of his death. None of his relatives knew where he had been, where he had worked, why he had ended up in Adelaide, and what the codes were that remained in the book. Even after the identification, one detail remained that no one could explain. Why would someone have so thoroughly destroyed his traces without even leaving a tag on his clothes? If it was simply death, why did it feel like a coded message? And most importantly, for whom was it intended? Perhaps Tamam Shud truly does mark the end. But perhaps, in this case, the end was only the beginning of another story, one that no one wants to tell, and one that, 7 decades later, remains as tightly sealed as the vanished biography of one man on an Australian beach, the mystery of the Hong Kong boat Sampan. In December 1955, residents of a Hong Kong wharf noticed a boat slowly drifting toward shore, unresponsive to signals. The vessel was old, wooden, a typical local fisherman's sampan, but inside, everything looked unlike anything aboard a live vessel. Not a single person, not a sound. The sail was down, the oars were in the boat, and the lights were out. However, the water in the bucket was fresh, the kettle was warm, and someone had recently eaten. When the local sailors boarded, they found no signs of panic or struggle. Clothes lay neatly folded on the deck. Family photos, icons, and personal belongings lay in the cabin. Everything looked as if they had just disembarked. The only thing that disturbed the calm was dried blood on the railing, a thin streak as if from a cut. Not a single trace of where the crew had gone. No bodies, no news. According to the documents, there were 3 fishermen, a father, a son, and a nephew. They had set out 2 days earlier. The forecast was normal, with no waves. Contact with them was lost 6 hours after setting out. They never returned to port. A search was launched, but no boat found a trace of them, until the sampan approached the pier. On its own, as if from memory. The investigation revealed nothing. All the belongings were in place. The food supply was not exhausted. The compass was working. The engine was manually shut off. The radio was off. On the table was an open notebook. The last entry: "We hear, but we cannot see." No context, no explanation. Things got stranger when one of the inspectors inspecting the boat began complaining of headaches and auditory hallucinations. 3 days later, he was hospitalized with paranoia, claiming that the boat remembers something. His colleagues chalked it up to fatigue. But a week later, another officer filed a report claiming to have heard breathing in the boat while alone. They tried to dismantle the sampan, but something always got in the way. Documents disappeared, equipment malfunctioned. Ultimately, the boat was left in a warehouse, locked up. It remained there until the 1970s, when it suddenly burned down in a fire one night. No other boats were damaged. The cause of the fire was never found. It's rarely remembered now. It's sometimes mentioned in records of maritime anomalies as the boat that came alone. But for those who remember, the feeling remains that the sampan didn't simply return. She returned empty, deliberately, as if something that was inside remained, not outside, but inside her. And everything that had left with the people remained in the boat, not as a memory, but as a presence that didn't want to be found, only heard, but too late. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson. In May 2008, a 19-year-old college student named Brandon Swanson was returning home to Marshall, Minnesota after an end-of-semester party. He was sober, driving carefully, and called his parents around midnight to report being stuck on the side of the road. He said he'd veered into a ditch and couldn't get out. Phone reception was clear. He explained where he was and asked to be picked up. But when his father arrived, Brandon was gone. Thus began one of the strangest disappearance stories in modern America. The parents continued to talk to their son on the phone. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. The entire time, Brandon said he was walking along the road toward the city lights. He didn't sound scared, he wasn't panicking, he knew where he was going. And then suddenly, he fell silent. His last words were, "Oh, shit," and silence. The signal was lost. The phone no longer answered. It didn't hang up. It was just never picked up again. They tried to track his location using cell towers. It turned out he wasn't where he thought he was. A day later, the police began searching. Brandon's car was found on a dirt road 30 kilometers from the reported location. Everything inside was intact. No signs of struggle, No signs of damage. They searched fields, forests, and drainage canals. They scrambled helicopters and used dogs. The trail led to a single cornfield and then vanished. No traces of blood, clothing, or anything. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. Later, experts noted something odd. Brandon knew the area well. He couldn't have made such a big mistake. And even if he'd taken a wrong turn, why hadn't a single camera, a single witness, a single piece of clothing provided a clue? Some speculated that he had fallen into a body of water, but searches with drones, echo sounders, and divers yielded no results. There was little water in the area, and the body was inevitable. And the phone continued to signal for several hours, as if it were still on the surface. Years later, his family secured passage of Brandon's Law, requiring police to respond immediately to reports of missing adults, not waiting 24 hours. But Brandon himself was never found, neither alive nor dead. His case became more than just a missing persons report. It was a story that lacked explanation, no motive, no conflict, no direction, only a voice walking in the darkness with a precise sense of direction, and the sudden silence that came at the moment when he might have actually seen something. Some say he simply went the wrong way that night, but no one clarifies what exactly the wrong way means, if the tracks end in a dry field under a clear sky, and if the man didn't fall, didn't run, wasn't kidnapped, but simply vanished between two words. Signal O from Mars. In 1995, a team of astronomers from the European Southern Observatory in Chile were conducting routine observations of radio noise coming from the planets of the solar system. Among other things, they were aligning their equipment with Mars, studying signals reflected from the planet's ionosphere. Everything proceeded according to protocol, until over the course of 5 seconds, the instruments detected a narrow-band pulse that had no analog in any observation archive. The signal emanated from a distinct frequency range, inconsistent with natural phenomena. It was too smooth, too focused. Its characteristics resembled an artificial source. They simply named it O, from oddity. It appeared once, in a fixed location, and never recurred. Astronomers didn't immediately attach any significance to this. But later, upon reanalysis, it turned out that at the moment the signal was received, the antenna was pointed at Schiaparelli Crater, one of the oldest and most studied structures on the surface of Mars. A coincidence, perhaps, but too precise to simply dismiss. Repeated attempts to listen to the same section revealed no activity. However, something odd emerged. Modulations resembling binary code were detected in the magnetic recording of the signal. They couldn't decipher them. Technically, there was too little data, but attempts continued. One of the physicists who worked with the original recording later wrote in his personal notes, "This isn't a message, it's a marker," as if someone was checking to see if we were listening. Publication of the results was delayed. The article appeared only 4 years later, and only in a specialized journal. There was no press release, no interviews were given. The data was archived, but the original raw file disappeared a few weeks later. The reason was a technical update. NASA knows about the O signal, unofficially. Some engineers working with Martian satellites claim that similar pulses have appeared again, but at different frequencies, and each time, only once. No repeats, as if something on the dusty, silent planet were stirring from time to time. There's a theory that it was a reflection of a signal from Earth, accidentally reflected off the Martian ionosphere. But calculations don't support this effect. The angle, intensity, and structure of the pulse don't match a possible reflected wave. It came from there, not from us. Today, the O signal is forgotten. It hasn't become part of the official observational history, but it remains a source of conversation among those working with telemetry, because no one knows what's worse. If it was just a system glitch, or if it was something that actually came from Mars, once, precisely, and never happened again. As if someone marked a period, and then no longer responded. The phenomenon of children with black eyes. Beginning in the mid-1990s, a consistent pattern of reports began appearing in English-speaking countries. Letters, blog posts, and then videos, in which people described encounters with children with completely black eyes. Not in the sense of the color of the irises, completely black, from eyelid to eyelid, without whites, without highlights, as if bathed in a film of ink. These children always appeared in pairs. They approached houses and cars, stood at doors, and begged to be let in. They didn't scream. They didn't display aggression. They just stared persistently. The first cases were reported in Texas, then in the UK, Canada, and Australia. All the stories had one thing in common: a strange sense of something wrong. People said they were overcome with panic, not because of their appearance, but because of the feeling that an alien construct had appeared in reality, one that made no sense, as if the children knew more than they should, as if they weren't children at all. They asked for the phone, to ask to come into the house, to ask for directions. They spoke politely, but in a rhythm devoid of real intonation, as if they were acting out a script. When they were refused, they didn't get angry. They simply left. And it remained a feeling that something was unfinished, as if you opened the door but didn't let someone in. Some cases involved electronic malfunctions. One person claimed a light bulb in the hallway burst the moment the children approached the door. Another claimed a tape recorder started playing backwards. There were also those who let them in. One man in Oregon said he let 2 such children into his house, only to develop a severe migraine and a nosebleed. The children left within 10 minutes. His dog died the next morning. Doctors found nothing wrong, just functional malfunctions without cause. Scientists explain the phenomenon as hallucinations, viral psychology, and collective mythologization. It's possible. But something else is strange. No one captured these children on camera in real time. All footage is either lost or distorted. Faces become blurry. Sound is distorted. It's as if they are present only in the moment, not preserved. In some religious circles, children with black eyes are associated with the concept of a cross spirit, an entity that appears in a form most closely associated with trust. And the most reliable way to enter the world is considered to be a request to enter. If that's true, then they never come without a reason. Then they're a test. And if you let them in, something shifts. Not immediately. Not loudly. It's just that the root of something that was supposed to bypass it changes. And the most frightening question here isn't who are they, but what will happen the first time someone lets you in and doesn't tell anyone about it, because they won't be able to, or because it won't be them anymore. In the explosion in the metropolis that no one is talking about, on the night of August 3rd or 4th, 1973, a powerful explosion occurred in an industrial area of Metropolis, Illinois. It was heard nearly 20 kilometers away. Windows in houses shook, alarms went off even in residential areas. Witnesses saw a flash, bright, blue-white, tearing the sky for a split second. But within minutes, silence. No sirens, no fire trucks, no news reports. Official sources have not registered anything, no emergency, no man-made accident. The police gave a brief comment. There was minor smoke on the plant grounds. The situation is under control. But photographs taken by eyewitnesses showed something different. The entire hangar housing the experimental research laboratory was completely destroyed. The foundation was charred. The metal was melted. Everything around was a crater, and not a single body. The employees listed in this building disappeared from the records. Their biographies became untraceable. Some were transferred. Others quit for family reasons. All attempts to contact them were unsuccessful. Their homes were sold. Their medical records were sealed. Their relatives remained silent. A month later, local residents began noticing strange things. Antennas were installed in the abandoned area. Then, a dome resembling a temporary storage facility appeared. Uniformed men without insignia appeared around. One of them, according to a passerby, responded to the question, "What was here?" with, "Nothing you'd like to remember." Internal documents obtained through an anonymous source claim that the laboratory was conducting work on so-called temporal stress of materials, experiments on the stability of matter under anomalous electromagnetic pressure. In simple terms, this could have been an attempt to create a localized time distortion. The story sounds like science fiction, but the details match some descriptions of the effect in other, declassified Cold War-era projects. According to this data, there was no fire at the moment of the explosion. A shift occurred. The space containing part of the building began to turn inside out, not by an explosion, but as if from the inside. Everything inside disappeared. It didn't burn. It didn't evaporate. It became inaccessible. Later, a dome with a radar-absorbing coating was installed at the site. Sensors around the perimeter detected a faint background noise. Not radiation, not heat, not sound. Something else. The reports listed it as undetectable density. Metropolis is a city where today there is no mention of this, no plaque, no anniversary, only a blank spot on the map, and the rare conversations of those who remember that night. They talk not about the explosion, but about the silence after it, about how, for a moment, all sounds disappeared completely, as if it wasn't the air that was ringing, but time itself. And if they really were trying to sever the boundary between the present and something else in that building, perhaps they succeeded. What they didn't know was that someone on the other side was watching, or waiting, and now they were simply observing until someone turned the equipment back on. Black Dolphin is a mysterious prison. In southwestern Russia, not far from the border with Kazakhstan, stands a gray concrete building with no windows, no signs, and no traffic. It's hard to find on a map, but among a select few, it's known as the Black Dolphin. Officially, it's a maximum security penal colony for life-sentenced prisoners. Unofficially, it's one of the most secretive and sinister prisons in the world, about which far less is known than about other facilities of similar scale. And not because there's nothing to tell, but because perhaps it shouldn't be told. The prison got its name from a strange sculpture near the main gate, a black figure of a dolphin, its head bowed as if in a gesture of surrender. No one knows why it was there or who created it. The sculpture stands, covered in rust, on a concrete platform, in the middle of nowhere. No information, no tour photos, no official brochures. Only reports on the treatment of those convicted of particularly serious crimes, and a strange reputation that extends beyond the brutal regime. Inside, everything is designed to deprive the prisoner not only of freedom but also of any sense of time. Each cell has constant lighting, with no day-night cycle. Windows, if any, are covered with concrete canopies that block out sunlight. Prisoners don't know whether it's morning or evening outside. They don't see the stars or the rain, and they don't sense the changing seasons. Everything is static, eternal gray, eternal ceiling. The system of movement between zones is built on the principle of complete control. When a prisoner is let out, he bends at the waist, hands behind his back, and his head is lowered. He is not allowed to look at the staff. He can't see the routes he's being led along. That is, he can't remember where he is. Even if he wanted to run, he has nowhere to go. He doesn't know where he is at all. But the essence of Black Dolphin isn't just its harshness. It's that some prisoners disappear from all records. They don't die. They don't get released. They simply vanish. Their numbers disappear from the database. Their files become inaccessible. The staff always give the same answer: transfer. But no one will say where. There are rumors that deep within the prison there are areas that even regular guards have no access to. Old Soviet concrete shafts leading underground, cells without ventilation. There are rooms without lighting, and where the surveillance cameras don't work. One former employee anonymously reported that there are sections that don't house criminals, but rather figures not designated as human beings. He declined to elaborate. There are also unofficial records of prisoners who began speaking languages they had never known, or writing in symbols reminiscent of Sumerian or Pre-Phoenician. Medical commissions recognize this as a sudden psychotic episode, but no one explained why these psychoses recurred only in one wing, and only among those transferred there after a status review. Some researchers who study prisons as psychoarchitectural structures argue that the Black Dolphin is built not only as a place of detention, but also as a system of presence suppression. It's as if an environment has been created within it where consciousness loses its orientation, where time loses its consistency, where you're not simply imprisoned, you're erased as an observer. It sounds like a metaphor, until you start comparing the geographic location of the property, the materials used for the interior partitions, the lack of electronic documentation in certain areas, and especially the lack of satellite images of the roof. Even in the 21st century, images of this area are distorted and blurry. It's as if even satellites can't focus on this point. Among the conspiracy theories is the theory that the Black Dolphin does not house criminals, but rather those who have become carriers of information that cannot be disseminated. Not necessarily spies, but perhaps those who manage to see something that doesn't fit into the world. And now they can't be released. But they can't be killed either. Only isolated, in a space that doesn't even register their existence. Maybe that's why the prison exists for a reason. Maybe it doesn't guard. It contains. Not the prisoners, but the very information they carry within. And the black dolphin at the entrance isn't a symbol. It's a reminder that even from the depths, something can return. And it would be better for it not to know the exit. The city that disappeared, Anjikoni, in the icy expanses of northeastern Greenland, in a place where even today human footsteps rarely tread, there existed at the beginning of the 20th century a settlement called Anjikoni. It wasn't large, just a few dozen residents, hunters, missionaries, and a couple of European explorers. It was unknown, no industry, no trade routes. But that's precisely why its disappearance was so terrifying. Because it happened quietly, without explanation, and without a trace. Anjikoni first came to light in 1907 when a team of scientists sent by the Danish Geographical Society attempted to map the region. They discovered that the spot designated as a permanent settlement was completely empty. No smoke, no movement, no traces. Only the remains of buildings, house frames, abandoned tools, torn sleds. It was as if the people had up and left. Overnight. The provisions were still there. The lamps were lit, the beds were made, cups stood on the table, and in the corner of one of the huts, a child's toy, half buried in the ashes. As if someone had simply vanished between two breaths. No animals, no bodies, no graves. The official explanation was guarded. Climate change, famine, migration. But residents of a neighboring village, 100 kilometers away, claimed to have seen a strange glow over the horizon a few days before the expedition. It lasted for over 20 minutes, was silent but too perfectly shaped, like a dome. Afterward, the sky became too dark, as if night had fallen at the wrong time. The topography of Anjikoni itself has also changed. Maps made at the beginning of the century showed a lake 2 kilometers from the village. Today, it's gone. It's disappeared. The soil beneath the village is unstable. Magnetic fluctuations within a 3-kilometer radius are 10 times higher than the average. Compasses refuse to show direction. GPS is intermittent. In 1962, a group of military geologists attempted to use this area for a weather station. A week later, the project was shelved. Not because of the weather, but because 3 engineers refused to continue the work, claiming that at night they heard footsteps in the snow behind the tent, even though no one was nearby. The sounds never recurred, but the alarm remained. The reports didn't mention this, only the terse, unfavorable conditions. Later, one of the geophysicists involved in that project admitted that he'd found a carving on a wooden beam in an old hut that remained on the site of the village. It was a word in a language that didn't match either Greenlandic or Inuit. He sent a photo to the museum but received no response. A month later, the image had faded from the film. Literally, the film was empty, as if the image couldn't be preserved. Some believe Anjikon never existed, that it's a map error, but there are too many coincidences, too many people who were there, saw it, and never returned. All that remains are the coordinates, and a strange radio silence zone where even military communications are blocked. If the city disappeared, it disappeared not in space, but in the structure of memory itself, as if the place decided that certain traces should not be left. Not for history, not for explorers, not for maps. And if one day someone were to appear there again, they would see not ruins, but nothing. Because sometimes nothing is too much and too precise to be an accident. The disappearance of the Sauter children. Christmas night, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, should have been ordinary. Everything was going according to plan in the Sauter family home. Fairy lights, a fireplace, the children almost asleep. George and Jenny Sauter had 10 children. 5 of them were in their rooms on the 2nd floor. The rest were sleeping downstairs. At 12:30 a.m., the fire broke out. The house burned suddenly and swiftly, as if it wasn't the wood that was burning, but the space itself. George and Jenny managed to escape with some of the children, but 5 remained upstairs. The firefighters didn't arrive until 8 in the morning. The house had burned to the ground. Nothing of the children was found. No bodies, no bones, not even charred belongings. It was as if they had never been there at all. At first, everyone assumed the children had died in the fire, but then something happened that still has no logical explanation. Fire experts declared that, given the temperature and the length of the fire, bodies, bones, and teeth should have been at least partially preserved. But there was nothing. The house burned quickly, but not so quickly that it was completely reduced to ashes. The concrete basement remained intact. Ash is too light. Even animals have been found after fires, but here not a single fragment. Additionally, strange calls and messages began coming in immediately after the fire. One woman claimed to have seen 5 children in a car driving through town the day before. Another claimed to have seen them at breakfast at a motel in another state. These accounts were treated with skepticism, until a photo mailed by Jenny in 1967 surfaced. On the back was written, "Boy, Louis Soder. I love brother Frankie. 111 boys. A90132 or 35. The face in the photo did indeed resemble one of the sons who disappeared in the fire, but no confirmation was ever obtained. The Soder family remained in disbelief for the rest of their lives that their children were dead. They erected a billboard by the road with photographs of the 5 children and the question, "Where are they?" The sign stood for over 30 years. It became a symbol that not all tragedies end with remains. Some end with disappearances without cause, and an attempt to believe that there was a different ending. Alternative theories include kidnapping, threats, intervention by those who wanted to silence George. He openly criticized Mussolini's regime and received threats. Some believe the fire was a cover, that the children were taken away, that the entire operation was planned in advance. But why? Why? And most importantly, where did their memory go? The house was demolished. No remains were ever found. The official version remains, the children died. Unofficially, it's a case in which the fire burned not the bodies, but the evidence. All that remains is a photograph, and a note posted decades later, "I am Louis." If it was a deception, it lasted too long. If it's true, then somewhere, in some house, there were children who knew who they were, but couldn't tell. And they didn't return, because they didn't know how, or they weren't allowed to, or they became someone else. A resident of Torad is a man without a country. In the summer of 1954, a middle-aged man arrived at Tokyo's Haneda International Airport. Dressed elegantly, he spoke French, Japanese, and several other languages. He passed through passport control, presenting documents and a visa. Everything seemed fine, until the officials noticed the strange name of the country on the passport. It read, Taurat. Such a country didn't exist. The border guards thought it was a mistake, but the man insisted, Taurat is a European country between France and Spain. He showed a map. It did indeed show a region, but it didn't correspond to the actual geographic boundaries. He claimed it was an ordinary state, one that had existed for 1,000 years. He came to Japan on business. It was his 3rd trip to the country. He showed a driver's license, commercial papers, even currency that looked like French francs. Everything was counterfeit, and everything had no obvious signs of tampering. The man was taken to an interrogation room. Consular representatives were summoned. No one could explain his origins. His language was known. His accent was recognizable. But there were no documents confirming his identity listed in any database. The company he mentioned was also nowhere to be found. The phone number he used to contact his business partners was non-existent. He was placed in a hotel under guard, in case he was delirious or planning some elaborate scam. 2 officers were on duty around the clock. The room was on the top floor. The windows didn't open. The door didn't lock from the inside. In the morning, he disappeared. There was no trace of escape inside. No fingerprints, no belongings, no clothes, just an empty bed. It was as if the man had simply ceased to exist. All attempts to find him in Japan, and later around the world, had been unsuccessful. He hadn't crossed the border, he hadn't left the country, he had vanished from the map, just like his country. Some believe it was a mistake, or a joke, or a carefully planned provocation, but the documentation remains. There are official records, officers' testimonies, protocols, and they all have one thing in common. The man believed Torad existed. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't playing around. He knew the laws, the history, the culture. Among the strangest theories is the reality-shifting hypothesis, that a man arrived from a parallel world, similar to ours, but with different boundaries, with a different past, with different maps, and accidentally ended up here, in this one, where his country never existed, where his documents are fake, where his history is a mistake. Because if you imagine that there are worlds almost identical to ours, but with different countries, different roads, different solutions, then one mistake in the route could lead you to the wrong airport, and you'll realize it too late. And if the man from Torad really did come from there, then where did he return? Or did he return alone? Cryptocurrency and the death of Gerald Cotton. In December 2018, the cryptocurrency world was rocked by the news. Gerald Cotton, the 30-year-old CEO of Canada's largest crypto exchange, Quadriga CX, died suddenly in India. The official cause of death was complications from Crohn's disease. The funeral was held quickly. But a few weeks later, it emerged that Cotton was the only person with access to the exchange's cold wallet keys, which held over $200 million in digital assets. The money was gone. It was impossible to withdraw, and impossible to recover. The company announced technical glitches, then an unforeseen loss of access. Customers began to panic. Investigations began. But the deeper they dug, the more it looked less like a tragedy and more like a carefully planned operation. Shortly before his death, Cotton changed his will, making his wife his sole heir, just 2 weeks before his trip to India. He also opened several offshore accounts, transferred assets, and suddenly outsourced some of the company's operations. Legally, everything was in order, but it looked as if he was preparing to disappear. Moreover, the hospital in India where he died had a controversial reputation. His death was recorded by a doctor whose name could not be verified in the medical registry. His body was cremated quickly, despite this being contrary to the rituals of his religion. The death certificate contained errors. The signature differed from other documents. The investigation revealed that Quadriga CX had been operating without adequate reserves for months. Some transactions were processed through Cotton's personal accounts. Others simply disappeared. His business partners claimed they had no access to the system. One even admitted, "I didn't know where the money was." Theories have emerged. The most popular? Cotton faked his death, withdrew his assets, and disappeared. In a world where cryptocurrency allows one to disappear without a trace, he may have been supported by larger players interested in maintaining his silence. Some even claimed he started a new life under a different name, in Eastern Europe or Asia. There's no confirmation, but there's no refutation either. There's another theory. Cotton really did die, but not on his own. That he was eliminated because he knew too much, because he controlled more than he should have, because access to millions in an unprotected form is more dangerous than it seems. The body was never exhumed. Requests for a re-examination were denied. The Canadian police closed the case without a conclusion. Officially death. Unofficially, billions disappeared. And the feeling that digital anonymity turned out to be more real than even its creators expected. Maybe Cotton left not because of illness, but because he found a way to rewrite his presence in the system. Not delete, not change, but reset, and become someone who can no longer be found. Not in the blockchain, not in the passport, not in the world where identity is tied to a name, because he took the name with him and left only an empty cell. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. On July 30th, 1975, around 2:45 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa, the former head of the powerful Teamsters Union, left the Machus Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit. He had arranged a meeting with two notorious mobsters, Anthony Giacolone and Anthony Provenzano. It was supposed to be an attempt to regain control of the union. He never showed up again. Hoffa was a legend. Under his leadership, the Teamsters became one of the most powerful organizations in America. He controlled billions of dollars in pension funds, used not only for the benefit of workers, but also to finance projects connected to the mafia, construction, and politics. He knew too much, and he kept silent for too long. When he disappeared, a massive operation was launched. Police, the FBI, private investigators. No one could understand how a man of his caliber could simply vanish. His car was found in a restaurant parking lot. There was nothing inside. No signs of a struggle, no evidence. Not a single witness saw him leave. It was as if he had entered someone else's car and vanished. The first thing that surprised investigators was the inconsistency of the witnesses. Some said they saw Hoffa with a shadow of security guards. Others said he was standing alone. Security cameras, if there were any, were either not working or the recordings had disappeared. The only real clue was a call he made a few minutes before his disappearance, informing his family that his callers hadn't arrived and he was leaving. But he didn't leave. The FBI put forward dozens of theories: kidnapping, murder, cremation, burial under a stadium, dissolution in acid. None were confirmed. Many theorists believe he was killed on orders from the mafia, fearful that Hoffa would reveal details of his illegal financing. Others believe he was killed on orders from Washington, fearing he would regain power and seek revenge. But there are details that don't fit the overall pattern. For example, the fact that Hoffa's phone remained online for 12 hours after his disappearance, or the fact that one of the agents working the case received an anonymous envelope containing a map circling a warehouse in New Jersey. When they arrived, the building was empty, but in the center lay one item, a cigar box containing an old Teamsters Union pin engraved with the initials JH. No fingerprints, no explanation. There's a theory that Hoffa was exiled from the United States, that he was given a second life to keep him quiet, for good, or that he was still alive years later, kept in isolation, as the bearer of too sensitive information. Considering how many figures simultaneously had reason to eliminate him, it's entirely possible. But why? After decades, despite all the technology, all the interrogations, and dozens of confessions, has not a single body fragment been found? Not a single confirmed theory? Perhaps because Hoffa has become something more than just a man. He has become a void in history, an inkwell into which it's convenient to write off everything that can't be explained. And perhaps they never really looked for him, because if they found him, they'd have to explain who exactly helped him disappear, and why, even after half a century, no one wants an answer to that question. The legend of the Black Knight, the satellite that was never launched. High above the Earth, in orbit around dozens of artificial satellites, something dubbed the Black Knight has been regularly observed since the 1960s. Its shape is asymmetrical, angular, resembling a dark fold of metal or a curved piece of fabric. It's not listed on any international registry of space objects. Its trajectory is unstable. It belongs to no one. And strangest of all, it was first discussed back in the 1950s, long before such objects even existed. In 1954, 3 years before the launch of Sputnik 1, the American press published reports that the U.S. Air Force was tracking an unidentified object in low Earth orbit. This was impossible. Humanity hadn't yet launched technology into space. But the reports were repeated. Then they disappeared. In 1960, the U.S. Air Force officially confirmed that they had detected a dark object in a polar orbit. This differs from typical satellites, which are launched at equatorial speeds. Polar orbit requires entirely different resources. But at that time, neither the U.S. nor the USSR possessed the technology to maintain an object in such a trajectory. Photographs of the object first became publicly available in 1998. Astronauts aboard the shuttle Endeavour photographed something strange drifting near them. The object doesn't look like a satellite. Too uneven, too asymmetrical. NASA later calls it a fragment of thermal shielding. But space technology experts claim the shape, shadow, and dynamics are inconsistent with debris. The object behaves as if it were under control, even though it has no energy source. There are even stranger details. In 1973, Scottish astronomer Duncan Lunan claimed to have deciphered radio signals reflected from the object, allegedly received in the 1920s by Norwegian researchers. According to him, the signals contain an encrypted message, the coordinates of the star Epsilon Botis, and the phrase, "We've been observing you for 13,000 years. It sounds like a myth." But Lunan publishes calculations, graphs, and comparisons. He's been discredited, but he still doesn't abandon his theory. If we believe in the object's ancient origin, a disturbing question arises. Who left it in orbit long before the advent of human civilization? And why? But if it is, after all, a product of terrestrial engineering, why is no one admitting it? Why does it move from orbit to orbit without any propulsion systems? Why does every time it is detected, it disappear from radar a few days later? The Black Knight doesn't transmit. It doesn't respond. It simply is. Sometimes it appears on the horizon, sometimes it drifts among the satellites. It doesn't break the rules, but it reminds us that we're not the first, or perhaps not alone. And if this is an observation, it's too quiet not to be intentional, and too long-lasting not to be planned. Plateau and its giant drawings. In southern Peru, amid the rocky wastelands, lies one of the most mysterious places on the planet, the Nazca Plateau. From a bird's eye view, it appears to be an ordinary landscape scorched by the sun and wind. But as you climb higher, the scene changes. Hundreds of perfectly drawn lines, geometric shapes, spirals, and animal figures, birds, monkeys, spiders, lizards, spread across the desert surface. Some of them reach over 200 meters in size. These drawings, the Nazca geoglyphs, are not visible from the ground. They can only be fully recognized from the air. And for over 80 years, scientists, historians, and archaeologists have been unable to explain exactly how they were created, why, and who exactly created them. The first thing that strikes you about Nazca is its scale. Thousands of lines cut across the Earth's surface for tens of kilometers. They are perfectly straight. Sometimes they intersect at angles that coincide with the solstices. Some geoglyphs depict animals never seen in the region before. For example, a 9-fingered monkey, or a spider identical to a rare species found in the Brazilian jungles, thousands of kilometers from Nazca. The geoglyphs were created by removing the dark top layer of gravel, revealing a light, almost white soil beneath. It seems simple, but only if you forget that the figures had to be drawn in perfectly proportioned shapes without being seen in their entirety. At the time of their creation, people didn't have aerial vehicles. There were no accurate maps. There were no instruments capable of creating such things by eye. There are theories that the lines were used as an astronomical calendar. Some of them do indeed align with the sun's position on key dates of the year, but most do not. Other hypotheses suggest that these were roads for ritual processions, but many of the lines lead nowhere, ending abruptly or bending at odd angles that defy engineering logic. Some researchers speculate that the lines and figures were created as a gesture upward, as if those who drew them knew someone was watching from the sky. Or perhaps the act of drawing itself was not for observation, but to mark places of power, areas where anomalies occurred. This is confirmed by the fact that underground water channels matching the shape of the drawings were discovered under some of the geoglyphs. In 2018, new figures were discovered that had previously been undetectable due to their age. They were only discovered using drones. Among them were humanoid forms with elongated heads, spiral-like symbols, and sets of parallel lines that, when superimposed on a digital map, indicated the locations of other geoglyphs. It was as if the lines themselves were a code, a coordinate grid, or a program. Skeptics claim it's all a figment of the imagination. But they don't explain the main thing. Why haven't the figures been destroyed over hundreds of years? Why hasn't the wind, which carries away layers of soil, erased these lines? It's as if the plateau was chosen not only as a platform, but as part of a mechanism, as if they weren't simply drawing here, but interacting with something that can't be named. Today, Nazca is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but even in satellite images, its structure looks technical, not cultural, like a trace, like a message that needs no words, only shape and height. And the question is, if these figures weren't drawn for us, then who is supposed to see them? And has anyone seen them yet? The mystery of mannequin Piz in Japan. On one of the platforms of a Tokyo subway station on the Yamanote line, amid the flow of passengers, advertising screens, and the sounds of the train cars, stands a seemingly insignificant statue. It's a figure of a naked boy, with a look of complete calm on his face, performing a completely physiological act, urinating. There are statues like this all over the world. The most famous is in Brussels. But the Japanese version has one peculiarity. No one knows exactly where it came from or why. The official version is that the statue was installed in 1952 at the initiative of station staff. It was supposedly an attempt to add humor to the monotonous metro environment. But for decades, no one has produced the original documents or the name of the artist. Moreover, the figure itself changed several times, sometimes imperceptibly. The size, facial expression, even the position of the hands, they were slightly different. When asked about this, the station staff shrugged. It's always been like this. The statue has become a cultural center of attention. It's regularly dressed in costumes appropriate to the seasons or holidays. A New Year's kimono, a school uniform, a sumo wrestler's outfit. The clothes appear without warning. Sometimes at night, sometimes during the day. No one sees who's doing it. And it would all look like a city game, if not for the oddities. In 1998, a surveillance camera captured footage of the statue changing position. Very slightly, but the difference is clear. In one frame, the right leg is closer to the edge. In the next, it's the left. The interval between recordings was 27 seconds. The video was checked for editing. No glitches were confirmed. The camera was working properly. The recording was archived, but a year later, it was deleted. Officially, it was due to storage rotation. One station employee claimed to have noticed the statue wet one morning, even though it hadn't rained and the automatic system wasn't watering the platform. Another claimed that on New Year's Eve, the statue turned a few degrees toward the train. It's unknown who else witnessed this, but since then, The platform has become a destination not only for passengers but also for those looking for signs. Some believe the statue is a transitional object, not just a sculpture but an anchor, or even a sensor tracking something related not to physiology, but to the direction of attention. It doesn't observe, it records and reacts. In a Japanese blog post from 2006, a user named Overseer wrote, "When the boy stops peeing, the train will go the wrong way." The post was deleted an hour later, but a screenshot remains. And if this figure is more than a joke, then a strange question arises. Why is no one officially touching it? Why doesn't the mayor's office provide clarification or include it in the list of city art objects? Why is it there, but not recognized? Perhaps because, in a city where everything is controlled, some elements are left in place deliberately, as a reminder that not everything can be explained, and that even in a crowd, even in the subway, there are things that shouldn't be there. But they are there anyway, and people continue to stare at them, even if they seem like a joke. Ex Lopke from the depths, bloop sound. In 1997, the US Navy's underwater microphone network, created to monitor Soviet submarines during the Cold War, detected something that would later become one of the most discussed acoustic mysteries in the history of oceanography. The signal was given the code name bloop. Initially, it was kept under wraps, but when scientists from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, analyzed the recording, things only got stranger. The signal came from the South Pacific Ocean, near coordinates 50 degrees south latitude and 100 degree west longitude, a vast stretch of water far from any major ports, underwater volcanoes, or continental shelves. It was extremely loud. The recording was captured by several autonomous sensors located more than 3,000 kilometers apart. This meant the source of the sound was not just powerful, it was gigantic. But the main thing was the nature of the signal. It resembled a living sound, a rapid rise and fall, a frequency bend, as if something living had emitted a sharp, short call. However, calculations suggest that for such a sound to come from a living organism, it would have to be tens of times larger than a blue whale, the largest creature ever to have lived on Earth. This means it's either something unknown or not alive at all. NOAA made the signal publicly available. Millions listened to it. Biologists, geophysicists, and acousticians analyzed it. Dozens of theories emerged. Some claimed it was the sound of underwater ice flows shifting. Others claimed it was the noise of an underwater volcano. But no hypothesis matched the signal's timbre, frequency, or amplitude, and not a single seismic instrument at that time recorded lithospheric movement at the hypothetical point. NOAA employee admitted, "We don't know what it was. We only know it didn't happen again, in the same form, although not exactly." He hinted that similar but weaker signals had been detected in 2001 and 2004. However, they weren't named. No comment was made. There's another coincidence associated with the coordinates of the signal's source. Not far from the same spot, writer H.P. Lovecraft placed the fictional underwater city of Arlia, where the ancient cosmic god Cthulhu sleeps, in his stories. This coincidence has no scientific significance, but it became part of the legend, because in the ocean, where 80% of the depths remain unexplored even by instruments, any sound from the darkness is a possibility of something greater than one could imagine. Officially, bloop was explained as an ice glide, the movement of an underwater ice mass. However, internal NOAA documents indicate that the waveform analysis does not match known natural sources of this type. The reports call it a similar, but not identical profile. Today, bloop has become a symbol of how, even in the age of satellites and the global internet, the biggest, loudest, and most inexplicable things can happen in absolute silence. Because the ocean isn't just water. This is the planet's memory. And if one day it speaks, perhaps it's because something deep down awakens, or remembers. And it, like the sound, is still only a tentative one. Just one clap, one breath, one call, away, but not forever. The Tamam Shud case. Early in the morning of December 1st, 1948, passers-by discovered the body of a man lying at the water's edge on Somerton Beach, near Adelaide, Australia. He was dressed in a neat suit, his shirt was unmarked, his shoes were polished, and his face showed no sign of pain or fear. He lay on his back, his head against the breakwater, his arms at his sides. It was immediately clear that he had died recently, and it was not at all clear why. He had no identification documents. No wallet, no ID, no tickets. The tags on his clothes had been carefully cut off. No signs of violence, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Even his fingerprints didn't match any Australian or international databases. It was as if he'd never existed. An autopsy was performed at the morgue. The cause of death remained undetermined. Doctors found signs of internal bleeding, but no traces of poison, no toxins, no drugs, no alcohol. The only odd thing was that the stomach was empty, and the pupils were unusually constricted, as in an opiate overdose. But nothing detectable was found. A few days later, police discovered a tiny piece of paper in a hidden inside pocket of his trousers. Printed on it were 2 words: Tamam shud, a Persian phrase meaning end or completed. It was later determined that this phrase had been torn from the final page of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. Police began searching for the original copy, and they found it. One Adelaide resident reported finding the book in his car, left unlocked in a parking lot shortly before the incident. On the back of the book is a set of ciphers, strings of letters interspersed with symbols that don't match any known codes. None of the cryptographic systems worked. Decipherment was unsuccessful. The book also included the phone number of a woman living in Adelaide. She refused to acknowledge the deceased, but recoiled when shown a death mask. She never officially confirmed their relationship. It was later discovered that she had served as a nurse during the war and was involved with an officer who was involved in radio broadcasts. The connection was never proven, but the feeling remained. Local newspapers dubbed the deceased Somerton Man. He was buried with a plaque reading Unknown. The site became a pilgrimage site for those seeking espionage, conspiracies, and alternate realities. Over the years, the theory of intelligence involvement has been repeatedly put forward. The recording format, the letter cipher, the clipped tags, everything matched the signature of a professional working in the field. But if this was a spy, why was he framed so blatantly? Why was he allowed to die publicly? 70 years later, in 2022, genetic testing identified the man as Carl Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. It seemed the mystery had been solved, but the details didn't add up. Why was he in Adelaide without papers? Why did he have a book of codes? Why didn't any of his family report him missing? Experts say it's simply a sad story that has become a myth. But the myth hasn't disappeared, because it's not about a person. It's about the boundary between biography and disappearance. Because the name appeared, but the meaning remained where the body found on the beach had, in absolute silence, lying at the water's edge among unfinished sentences. Tama M. Shud is the end, but not the explanation. Chronicle of the Bloody Swamp. In northern Louisiana, amidst viscous swamps and crackling marshes, lies a stretch of land that locals prefer not to talk about. It's not marked on tourist maps. There are no signposted roads leading there, and even GPS units don't accurately display its boundaries. This place is called Bloody Bog. Legend has it that it was named that way back in the 18th century by French settlers, but there's no official confirmation of this. Like nothing official, really. And yet the chronicle of this place exists. Not in archives, not in universities, but in oral histories and diaries and half-erased newspaper clippings. Every decade, someone disappears. Without a trace. Or worse, returns. Different. The first recorded report dates back to 1851. A local pastor from the village of Laplace wrote to his brother about a wet plain that breathes at night. He described dreams in which he saw the swamp unfolding, as if opening a mouth. A month later, he was found dead inside his own well, filled not with water, but with silt, which was absent from the area. In 1909, a telegraph line was being laid in these areas. Of the 9 workers, 3 disappeared in one day. The remaining ones quit. The contractor's report stated, refusal due to absurd fear. Officially, the project was shelved, but an unofficial report sent to headquarters included the phrase, "The line is not being built because the terrain changes at night." In 1967, a local schoolteacher named John Matthews decided to document the region's folklore. He collected stories from old-timers about singing trees, instant twilight, and black water that doesn't reflect. One of the narrators said, "If you hear water when it's silent, go away." Matthews disappeared 2 weeks after completing the recordings. His car was found at the edge of a swamp. The audio cassettes were blank. The tapes were blank at all speeds, though the magnetic layer was intact. It was as if the recordings had been erased not by the device, but by the location itself. There are reports of mysterious fauna found nowhere else, glowing insects intertwined as one, voices repeating phrases not in English, not in French, but in a recognizably familiar language. In one case, a man reported that the swamp spoke with the voice of his dead brother. He later disappeared. Local search and rescue team members still refuse to enter certain zones. They call them return points. These are areas where compasses begin to spin, and time, according to volunteers, flows differently. One man said he was walking along a trail with a group, turned around at a noise, and found himself alone. It felt like a few seconds had passed. In reality, it felt like 4 hours. In 1998, scientists from a private university attempted to conduct a magnetometer scan of a swampy area. The equipment failed. A message appeared on the laptop connected to the sensor. You can't measure anything that isn't in a straight plane. This wasn't a system error, but a typed phrase. None of the specialists could reproduce it. Today, the bloody swamp is neither a myth nor a point on a map. It is a loop where patterns disappear, a place that refuses to be part of a reality that can be measured and recorded. Perhaps it is simply a swamp, or perhaps it is a place that does not belong solely to our time. And then it doesn't wait. It repeats itself, each time a little differently, with a different name, with a different voice, but with the same result. The tracks lead there, but from there, nothing is the same. Not even the air, not even the sound, not even the question itself. What if it's not a creature that lives in this swamp, but the absence of return itself? The mystery of the Tunguska explosion. The morning of June 30th, 1908, Central Siberia. A bright streak of fire appears over the taiga near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River. A few seconds later, an explosion. The roar is heard over a 1,000-kilometer radius. The shockwave knocks down trees over an area of over 2,000 square kilometers. The explosive pulse is so powerful that it's detected by seismographs across Eurasia. The light from the flash is visible even in London. Yet there's not a single crater, not a single piece of debris. Only fallen trees and silence. An expedition to the blast site only began in 1927. Leonid Kulik led it. What he saw defied explanation. The center of destruction was perfectly circular, but within the epicenter, trees stood, charred but not fallen. Outside, the forest lay in radial stripes, as if a wave had come from above. But there was no crater, no rocks, no meteorite, no traces of any substance that could be analyzed. Since then, many theories have emerged. The official one is a meteorite or comet exploding at an altitude of about 8 to 10 kilometers, but nothing remained of the meteorite. No dust, no debris. Spectral analysis reveals no traces of iron. A comet, but there's no trace of ice either. So what? In the 1960s, Soviet scientists proposed the idea of a natural nuclear explosion, the release of methane followed by spontaneous combustion in the atmosphere. However, not a single chemical trace was found to confirm this. Radiation levels were within normal limits. However, some plants exhibited abnormally high mutation rates, previously undocumented. Insects collected in the epicenter area decades later showed consistent DNA differences. Some trees exhibited double growth rings, as if 2 vegetative cycles had occurred in a single year. In the 2000s, indirect evidence emerged that, several days before the explosion, residents of nearby villages saw a strange glow in the sky, a soft, milky blue encompassing the entire horizon. The light had no source. It cast no shadows. There are theories about a mini black hole entering the atmosphere or about antimatter. Deviations in the Earth's magnetic field were indeed recorded in the Tunguska region for 48 hours after the explosion, but they didn't match any known burst type. Some researchers believe the object didn't arrive from outer space, but rather emerged from within. It's as if something had breached the geological crust. This theory is based on measurements showing unusual activity in the Earth's crust beneath the epicenter. Anomalous vibrations have been recorded there that shouldn't exist, and, more importantly, they repeat every 62 years. The last such tremor was recorded in the 1970s. The next one will be in the 2030s. Some believe the 1908 explosion was not a fall but a flash, as if something trapped in the ground was released for a moment. Not completely, but enough to leave an imprint in the air. Rumors also circulated about traces of unknown structures discovered in the 1930s and later classified. One participant in subsequent expeditions reported a stone engraved with symbols resembling simplified runes. The photo disappeared from the archives. the stone, has not been seen since. Today, the official position remains the same: a meteor. But in the archives of scientists who worked in the epicenter zone, the same phrase appears repeatedly. It wasn't a fall, it was an appearance. And if this is true, then the question is not what happened in 1908, but what should have happened, but was stopped, or delayed, and perhaps not forever. Highway of Disappearance in Canada. In northern British Columbia, Canada, stretches a long stretch of Highway 16. It winds through mountains, forests, and misty plains, connecting sparse settlements. This stretch is officially known as Highway 16, but it's popularly known as the Highway of Disappearance, or the Road of the Disappeared. And it's no coincidence. Since the 1970s, dozens of disappearances have been recorded here, most of them without explanation, traces, or logic. Many of the victims are young women and girls, most of whom are of indigenous descent. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. One case, tragedy. Two, alarm. But when the number of missing persons passed 40, then 60, questions began to arise. Why here? Why didn't the police respond in time? Why was evidence being lost? The highway stretches over 700 kilometers. It often runs through completely empty terrain. No lights, no gas stations, no communications. Hitchhiking is the only way to get around for those without a car. Many of the missing are hitchhikers. They were the last people seen getting into a van, a truck, or simply walking along the side of the road. After that, silence. Phones went silent. Relatives waited. But no one returned. Police often attributed the disappearances to mundane causes, running away from home, suicide, starting a new life. But the bodies were never found, or they were found years later, in impassable places, with no signs of violence and no clear cause of death. In one case, the remains were found 300 meters from a highway, but were only discovered 8 years later. Someone said, "It's as if they were put there later." But there are cases that defy even criminal logic. In 1992, a girl named Josie McDonald went missing. She was seen at a gas station where she called her mother. 5 minutes later, she was gone. For the next 8 hours, abnormal bursts of radio interference were recorded in the band used by emergency services. No one knew where they were coming from. 4 days later, her backpack was found in the forest. It was dry, even though it had rained for 2 days. Inside was a voice recorder. The recording contained only breathing, but not hers. Too deep, too calm. The last sound was a rustling sound and a man's voice, barely audible. This is not the right place. Caution! Disappearance zone signs were installed along the highway. Helpline numbers were posted. But people continue to disappear, even today. Some locals say the road is alive, that it takes you away, that it contains repetitions. The same places, the same dates, the same faces. In one village, a woman said she saw a girl in a blue coat on the side of the road, whom she identified as her friend who disappeared 10 years ago. She was standing there, just like that time, raising her hand, asking for a ride. The woman didn't stop. Officials have finally acknowledged the problem and created a commission. But the reports are too general, too cautious. It's as if everyone is afraid to admit that the disappearances aren't random. They're recurring. And if this isn't simply the work of humans, then the Zniknenya Highway isn't a road. It's a mechanism, or a cycle, or an access point where reality shifts for a split second, enough for a person to step out of it. Without a trace, without a sound, without an explanation, just a lane, and the emptiness left behind. The disappearance of Amanda Jones. In August 2005, 26-year-old Amanda Jones arrived in Festus, Missouri, to meet the father of her unborn child. She was 8 months pregnant, had a stable job, an active life, and her family knew of her plans and destination. The meeting was supposed to take place during the day in a public place near the courthouse, but no one saw her again after that. Her car was found in the parking lot, locked. The keys were in her pocket. Her purse was on the front seat. Her phone was turned off. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no witnesses. The building's security cameras recorded her arrival, but not her departure. It was as if she simply disappeared inside, or exited through an unregistered location. The investigation established that she had indeed planned to discuss paternity and future child support issues with a man, Jerry Pickett. He acknowledged the meeting but claimed she didn't show up. However, her cell phone was registering activity near his house. His words began to diverge from the facts, but they found no direct evidence of guilt. No clues, no witnesses, no body. What made this disappearance particularly strange was the time of day and location. Amanda vanished in the center of a small town during the day, on a hot summer day, in an area where there was always someone walking. Not a single passerby, not a single court employee, not a single visitor saw her leave or who she was with. It was as if she had vanished between two CCTV cameras. The trail ended, like bad edits in a film. Later, her family received a strange, anonymous call. A female voice, quiet and quick, said, "Amanda's here. She doesn't remember." The connection was cut off. The number was inactive. The call could not be repeated. According to one unofficial theory, Amanda may have been the victim of something other than just a crime. Some researchers studying soft zones, areas with disruptions in spatio-temporal logic, have suggested that the location of her disappearance coincides with a number of other strange incidents that have occurred in the area over recent decades. Sudden memory lapses, navigational failures, and the disappearance of pets, all within a 4-mile radius. There's a theory that in such zones, there's an overlap of realities from which a person can slip, not die, not vanish violently, but simply move to a layer where they're not listed. In such a scenario, Amanda could even continue to live, just not within this coordinate structure, somewhere nearby, unnoticed. It sounds incredible. But the more time passes, the more obvious it becomes. All attempts to find her here are ending in nothing. Because perhaps she is no longer here. Not in our here. Perhaps she stepped beyond the line, not knowing such a line existed. And now, out of reach, not as a witness, not as a victim, not as someone who disappeared. Just a name, just a date, just an empty space where no one enters. With a monk standing in fire, the archives don't lie. On June 11, 1963, in the center of Saigon, the capital of what was then South Vietnam, a blue Austin stopped at an intersection near a busy square. An ordinary car, of which there were thousands. Several Buddhist monks emerged from it. One of them, an elderly man with a perfectly shaved head and a calm face, sat down in the lotus position right on the asphalt. His name was Tish Quang Duc. The others poured a canister of gasoline on him. He didn't move when they set him on fire. For 6 minutes, the monk burned in complete silence. No screams, no convulsions. A crowd gathered around. People sobbed, screamed, tried to close their eyes. He didn't move. He just sat and burned until the very end. Later, reporter Malcolm Brown, who took the famous photo, would say, "I was photographing death, but I didn't feel like I was photographing a dying man." This action was a form of protest against the repression of the Buddhist community in the country. But it became more than an act of sacrifice, because even after all these years, questions remain that transcend reality. First, the body's behavior. Doctors studying the photographs and reports said the heat shock should have caused an immediate reaction. Screams, spasms, at least a single movement. But the monk's face didn't change. It didn't grimace. Its eyes were open. It remained in the lotus position until the very end, as if the pain had been removed, or something greater, activated. Secondly, the ashes. When the body burned out, a nearly perfect skeleton remained. The heart was not completely consumed. This was officially recorded. It was removed almost intact and later placed in a reliquary. Several attempts to move it were accompanied by strange events. Equipment malfunctioned, the glass cracked, and one of the monks lost consciousness. The heart was considered incorruptible. It was kept at the temple, and according to some, radiated warmth despite more than a year having passed. American intelligence agencies monitoring events in Vietnam recorded the incident in their analytical reports not only as an act of protest but also as an unpredictable psychophysical reaction. One CIA officer later wrote in a report, "This is not self-immolation. This is a demonstration of force, incomprehensible from a physiological standpoint." It is a common belief among Buddhist monks that Thich Quang Duc attained a state of samadhi, the highest state of mental concentration, in which consciousness can separate from the physical body. But even religious texts rarely speak of complete insensitivity to pain. Here, however, there was something beyond meditation. It was a disconnection from physical law. The archives of the U.S. Propaganda Service contain a curious document, an internal memorandum that examines the question of the impact of such acts on the structure of the population's perception of reality. It contains a phrase, underlined in red. If a person can voluntarily and without screaming burn themselves to death, what other control can we expect? After this, Similar acts of self-immolation were recorded in different parts of the world, but none replicated the effect, none retained their form, none was so undisturbed. Perhaps it's simply willpower. Perhaps it's absolute acceptance. But there's another possibility, that on that day, at that crossroads, what happened wasn't what it seemed. That man became a breaking point through which something greater entered. Silently, without gestures, without words, only through flame. And then he didn't burn. He left, leaving only an image. As a reminder, the body can be fire, but consciousness is no longer here. Intercepted radio signals from Saturn. In 2002, staff at a radio observation station in Argentina detected a narrowband signal emanating from a region of space that coincided with the coordinates of Saturn. This wasn't unique. Planets emit radio noise, especially gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn. But what they heard didn't fit the scientific norm. The signal had structure, an internal rhythm. It repeated itself, as if it contained a fragment resembling a pulse or speech. At first, scientists thought it was an equipment error, but a week later, the signal repeated itself. It was again received by several observatories, this time at different points on Earth. The angle of arrival was consistent, and the signal delay was stable. It wasn't a reflection, radio interference, or a transmission from Earth. Everything pointed to it originating somewhere near Saturn's ring structure. It later became known that similar signals had been detected previously, in the 1970s and 1980s, but were never made public. One NASA engineer who worked on the Cassini mission claimed that the probe's instruments also detected anomalous signals during flybys near the rings. Official reports described them as ring plasma radio noise, but the frequency of these pulses was too precise to be random. Some researchers involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, conducted a spectral analysis of the recording. The signal exhibited phase modulation similar to those used to transmit information over long distances. Its structure contained a repeating pattern of high-frequency pulses, similar to a digital signature. But most importantly, the signal's content didn't match any known natural format. It didn't resemble lightning discharges, turbulence, or magnetospheric oscillations. It sounded like a code, but it couldn't be deciphered. Later, in 2005, scientists working with the Voyager mission archives found a similar noise in recordings made as early as 1980. But at that time, it was mistaken for an internal glitch. Now it became clear. It was the same structure. Many believe this is simply a phenomenon, not yet described by science. But if the signals truly carry information, then a troubling question arises. Who or what could be transmitting a message from an area where there is no solid surface, where there are no stations, where nothing should be a stable source of a signal? One hypothesis, put forward by a Japanese theoretical physicist, suggests that Saturn's rings may act as a natural amplifier, a resonator capable of propagating a signal transmitted from another source. Perhaps not from the planet itself, but from within. From space, which is in constant radio shadow from Earth. Proponents of more extreme theories say Saturn isn't just a planet, that the rings are a structure left unnaturally, that they contain a built-in transmission system that works not for communication, but for recording, as if someone is listening not to us, but to the space between us. And at the right moment it gives a splash, too short to understand, too long to miss. These signals are rarely mentioned today. The last ones were recorded in 2013. After that, there's silence, or an incredibly deep silence, one that can only be heard when you learn to distinguish noise from what shouldn't be noise. And maybe it's not a transmission, maybe it's an answer to a question we haven't yet asked. Hram Nan Madol, Micronesia. On the east coast of the island of Pohnpei, in Micronesia, in the Pacific Ocean, lies one of the most mysterious structures of the ancient world, the ruins of the city of Nan Madol. Built directly on the water, among coral reefs, this complex consists of more than 90 artificial islands connected by stone passages and canals. Each island was formed from massive basalt blocks, laid with such precision that modern engineers find it difficult to replicate the design without the use of modern technology. The blocks weigh between 5 and 20 tons, some over 50. In total, by rough estimates, over 250,000 tons of basalt, not quarried nearby, were used in the construction. There are no volcanoes on the island capable of producing such rock. The nearest source is tens of kilometers across the ocean, and it is still unclear how the stones could have been transported by water, especially given that the ancient inhabitants did not have technologies such as lifting mechanisms or complex rafts. Nan Madol, according to local legends, was built by the will of the gods, or by men who came from the sky. Stories tell of two superhuman brothers, Ololo and Oluship, who used a flying stone to move boulders. These myths are often taken as metaphors, but they all point to the fact that the city was built quickly, not by hand, and with the help of an unknown force. The complex itself is organized like a perfectly planned city. There are palaces, burial structures, walls, and courtyards. Everything is geometrically precise. The water level inside the canals is stable even during high and low tides. This is impossible without regulation systems. But no such mechanisms have been found. The water doesn't stagnate. The canals remain clear. It's as if someone is still monitoring the circulation. Locals avoid visiting the ruins at night. They say they can hear footsteps and splashing sounds, though there are no large animals in these waters. Some claim that after sunset, bubbles begin to rise from the underwater part of the city, as if something is breathing underwater. Research has revealed that a second submerged structure exists beneath Nan Madol, ancient stone rows extending deeper than previously thought. The exact function of the city is unknown. Some believe it was an administrative and religious center, others that it was a necropolis. But there are also those who say it was a portal. On certain days of the year, sunlight filters through slits in the walls, forming a precise line running through the central channels. This has been observed by scientists and tourists. A natural phenomenon? Perhaps. But its precision is too subtle. Nan Madol was not a habitable city. No household items, utensils, or kitchen structures have been found there. However, there are a large number of tombs. The place appears to be a ritual center, not a settlement. As if something took place there that didn't require constant presence, only ritual. Some claim it's part of a lost civilization that predates all known cultures, an Atlantis of the Pacific Ocean, and that its remains are submerged not only in water, but also within the structure of the earth itself. Because if, in an ocean where everything should be destroyed, a city of incomprehensible basalt still stands, with canals that don't rot and walls that don't collapse, then someone built it not for themselves, but for someone else. Someone who was supposed to come later. And if this is true, then Nan Madol is more than just ruins. It is a reminder. That knowledge may not be forgotten, but deliberately hidden. Under stones, under water, under eyelids, and it waits, like the city, waiting, not for an explanation, but for a signal. Fresco with an astronaut in Salamanca. In the Spanish city of Salamanca, on the wall of one of Europe's oldest buildings, the Cathedral of Santa Maria de Medio, is something that doesn't fit into the familiar visual landscape of the 15th century. Among the ornate stone decorations, alongside Gothic arches, angels, griffins, and grapevines, one can see the figure of an astronaut. A spacesuit, a helmet, cables, even gloves and boots. All of this is engraved on the facade of a building built long before manned spaceflight. And this is no joke. The sculpture really does exist. It's real. And with each passing year, it raises more and more questions. The official explanation seems simple. Supposedly in 1992, during a facade renovation, one of the restorers decided to insert a modern symbol into the old composition as a sign of the times. This is called anachronism in art, and it's not uncommon in architecture. But there are nuances that cast doubt on this explanation. Firstly, the carving style itself is absolutely identical to the adjacent elements, created in the 16th century. The stone's patina is natural, with no traces of modern processing. The texture is uniform. If the element had been added in the 1990s, it would have been different. But the astronaut looks like part of the original composition, not an alien object. Secondly, photographs of the facade taken by tourists and researchers as early as the 1960s already contain the figure. They are not clear, but of sufficient quality to discern the general outline. This contradicts the theory that it was added in 1992. However, official authorities ignore these photographs, citing a lack of archive. Another detail is the figure's pose. The astronaut isn't simply standing. He's breaking through as if punching through a wall. His left hand is clutching a ledge. His right hand is pointing upward. His legs are slightly bent, like a person in zero gravity. This isn't a decorative element. It's a scene, an action, and it seems meaningful, but not for the 15th century. Skeptics point out that the figure may have been misinterpreted. Supposedly not an astronaut, but a stylized angel in armor. But why then does it have oxygen tubes? Why are there harnesses on its waist, reminiscent of seatbelts? Why are its feet covered with soles like those on NASA spacesuits? Some researchers have hypothesized that the fresco is not an anachronism, but a trace of ancient knowledge. It may have been restored in the Middle Ages from an older model, previously lost or destroyed. In this case, the cathedral is not the original source, but a copy that has carried over a fragment from a past that remembers more than it should. There's also an extreme version. The fresco is a warning, a coded image of something that will descend or has already arrived. For in the vicinity of Salamanca, in the monastery archives, there are records of a man in shining armor who appeared in the square and disappeared into the light. Date, 1537. A coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps a hint that remained, because even then they knew we would find out one day. And the fresco is not for believers, not for tourists. It is for those who will one day look up and see in the stone not just a figure, but a memory. That contact had already been made, but encrypted by stone, by shadow, by facade, in plain sight, but timeless. The secret of the helmet with horns. In 1942, while laying a drainage system in the marshy lands near the village of Vexa, Denmark, workers stumbled upon a strange metal object. They carefully removed it from the peat, and soon realized it was an iron helmet adorned with a pair of curved horns. It was almost completely intact, coated in a greenish layer of oxidation, but still retained its shape. Archaeologists initially attributed it to the Viking Age, as the image of a warrior with a horned helmet is deeply ingrained in popular culture. However, upon closer examination, it became clear that this artifact was not Viking. It was older, much older. Modern analysis dates the find to the 9th century BC. This makes it one of the oldest iron masks found in Europe, and it doesn't fit into any known culture of the region of that time, either in form or symbolism. Barely discernible engravings were discovered on the inside of the helmet, wave-like lines repeating around the circumference. They don't match known runic systems, but are strangely reminiscent of an electrical diagram, as if the symbolism were technical rather than ritualistic. A fragment of an amber inlay was discovered on one of the horns. Under a microscope, it revealed microscopic bubbles containing traces of metallic dust. How and why this dust got there remains unknown. Scholars have long debated the helmet's purpose. It's unclear. It wasn't designed for combat. It's too heavy, too exposed, and the horns are vulnerable. It's likely a ritual object. However, the horns point forward, not upward, as is typical of Bronze Age cult objects. This creates a sense of function rather than symbolism. What's also interesting is that this discovery isn't the only one. Similar horned masks, albeit in more fragmentary form, have been discovered in Spain, Sardinia, and even southern Sweden. All date back to roughly the same time. All are without cultural context. All are found in bogs, where preservation is only achieved by complete isolation from oxygen, as if someone deliberately placed them there to preserve them, or to hide them. One theory holds that the helmet isn't just a protective device, but a key element of the communication system. Its shape creates resonance at certain frequencies. Acoustic scientists have confirmed that if you recreate the helmet and pronounce sounds inside it, a distinct vibrational wave is generated that deviates from the standard frequencies of human speech. It's as if the helmet were designed to hear and transmit in a range other than ours. Norse mythology mentions horned beings who speak to the sky. These lines have always been considered a poetic metaphor. But if the Vex artifact is a genuine embodiment of such a function, then it's possible we're dealing not with the attribute of a priest or warrior, but with a device designed for communication, what with is unknown. At the Copenhagen Museum, where the helmet is kept today, the display case is surrounded by modern glass filters. Staff say this is to protect against moisture. But one of the leaked records mentions abnormal electromagnetic pulses being detected in the room after the display case was installed. They couldn't reproduce them, only record them. So what was it? Decoration? Forgotten technology? Or a warning? Maybe this helmet isn't for head protection, but for receiving a signal. One that was heard long ago. Or perhaps it's still heard. Only we don't hear it. Because we don't have what those who came before us wore. Horns forward, not up, not toward the sky, but toward what's approaching. Crimson rains in Kerala, India. From July to September 2001, crimson red rains began falling in the southern Indian state of Kerala. The first drops were spotted in the town of Changanassery. People initially thought it was blood. Then came the chemicals. Puddles in the streets turned scarlet, clothes were permanently stained, but there was no odor. The precipitation lasted only a few minutes, but fell regularly, sometimes at night, sometimes at dawn, sometimes during the day. Sometimes one rainstorm followed another within a few hours. The phenomenon affected more than 100 populated areas. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar red rains had fallen in this region before, in 1896, 1957, and 1970. But the scale of 2001 was unprecedented. Scientists began an investigation. The first explanation: desert dust in the air. However, water samples collected immediately after the rain revealed not dust, but a cellular structure. Microscopic examination revealed red, oval, densely coated shapes resembling bacterial spores in the droplets. However, no DNA was found. Repeated analyses in several countries yielded similar results. Organic structure, no signs of life. The strangest thing happened later. Researcher Godfrey Louis of Mahatma Gandhi University stated that these particles are capable of self-reproduction at high temperatures, over 300 degrees Celsius. No known life form on Earth can withstand such conditions. Moreover, the particles did not burn under normal heat treatment. They behaved like dormant organisms awaiting activation. Lewis hypothesized that they were an extraterrestrial life form delivered to Earth through the atmosphere, perhaps on a micrometeorite. His theory was called fantastic. He was criticized. But independent laboratories confirmed, yes, the structure of these particles is unusual. Yes, they do not contain DNA in its usual form. Yes, they are resistant to extreme conditions. When asked what they are, if not dust or bacteria, no one answered. Some hypotheses suggested a genetic injection, as if the Earth were being seeded, not to infect but to test a reaction, or to mark a point. And Kerala was chosen for a reason. It is home to one of the most ancient cultural centers, where legends already described rains of blood as a harbinger of change. Other researchers went even further. If we assume that particles are not just a form of life, but carriers of information, then their activity at elevated temperatures is not reproduction, but code unpacking. Red rain, then, is not ecology, but transmission. In 2013, the phenomenon repeated itself, briefly and in a different area. Authorities quickly dismissed it as a natural effect of evaporation and pollen. But the data showed, again, the same particles, the same properties, the same silence in the official reports. Today, drops with the same composition are stored in laboratories. They are not shown. They are not studied openly. Because the question isn't where they come from. What will happen if one day the rain turns from crimson to black, and then the sky will no longer be just the sky? It will become the bearer of what was already here, or what is waiting to be awakened, by chance, or on command. Rocks that move in Death Valley, on the dry bed of Racetrack Playa, a desolate section of Death Valley in California. Dozens and hundreds of stones lie among the cracked clay shell. At first glance, they look ordinary. Smooth, dark, weighing from a few kilograms to several dozen. But if you stay here longer than a tourist stroll, you'll notice something important. These stones move, and they leave traces behind them. Not in your presence, no. But you come back the next day and see, they've shifted. Sometimes tens of meters. The trace of each one is a thin furrow in the clay, as if someone was slowly pulling the stone. In a straight line, in an arc, in a spiral. Some turn, some change direction. Sometimes two stones move side by side, and then move apart, leaving a perfectly synchronized trail like in a mirror. This isn't a legend. It's been documented. Cameras have been installed, measurements have been taken. Scientists have proposed a theory. A thin layer of water formed after rain covers the clay, then thin ice forms on top, the wind blows, and the stone slowly slides. But this theory doesn't explain all the movements. For example, why do some stones move while others remain motionless, despite being in the same layer of water? Why do stones sometimes make sharp 90-degree turns? Finally, why can the same stone rest for years and then move 70 meters overnight? There are documented cases where movement occurred without visible wind or water. The furrow remained fresh. The clay remained moist. The stone appeared displaced, as if something had passed underneath it, or from within. Local Native American tribes had known about these stones for centuries. They called them living spirits seeking a way out. They forbade spending the night on the playa. It was said that if you fell asleep next to one of these stones, you too would begin to move, but you wouldn't wake up in the same place. Some researchers have put forward extreme hypotheses. Perhaps it's a residual effect of geophysical resonance associated with ancient magnetic anomalies. Perhaps it's a point where the density of space fluctuates, and solid bodies become capable of microshifts, not in the usual physics, but in something parallel. There was even a theory that the stones don't move, but are rewritten, as if their spatial position changed, not gradually, but discontinuously, instantaneously, and a trace remains, because clay is memory. Scientists continue to study, but everything still comes down to a strange simplicity. Stones move where nothing should move, without cause, without force, without spectators, which means perhaps they're not just moving. They're following a route, the very one that was once set, or transmitted, not to them, but to the earth. And they're simply marking it for us, in complete silence, and in complete clarity. Movement isn't always life. Sometimes it's a signal. Night of the Hotel Cecil. The Cecil Hotel, located in downtown Los Angeles, has long earned a reputation as the city's most sinister location. Since its opening in 1927, more than 60 deaths have occurred within its walls. Suicides, murders, mysterious disappearances, falls from upper floors. It has also served as a temporary refuge for serial killers, including Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. Many consider him cursed, but there's a story that's rarely discussed, even among all the other horrors. It involves a man in armor who appeared one night and vanished forever. They called him the Night of Cecil. In January 2005, a hotel security guard reported that around 3 a.m., security cameras captured a figure clad in metal armor slowly ascending the fire escape stairs. The metal gleamed in the dim light. The figure moved slowly but surely and without a sound. No scraping, no banging, just movement. At first, they thought it was someone in a costume, a setup, or an eccentric guest. But when they checked the registration logs, no one in armor was found. Camera footage from the elevators and entrances also failed to record his arrival. He appeared, as if from inside the building, from the 4th floor. Cameras watched him climb the stairs to the roof. There was no camera there. When security arrived 10 minutes later, there was no one on the roof, only footprints, not dirty, not wet. The imprints of heavy metal boots pressed into the gravel. That same night, the power went out in several hotel rooms. Guests reported a sharp drop in temperature and strange sounds like clicking or scraping in the pipes. One person on the 5th floor called the police, claiming someone in a shiny suit was standing outside his door, breathing as if wearing an iron mask. In the morning, the camera footage was copied, but upon playback, the image was distorted. The armor gleamed as if the light wasn't being reflected, but absorbed. There were no faces, marks, or symbols on the armor. Only smooth plates, a semi-matte sheen, and completely unrealistic joint mobility. Rumors spread quickly. Some said it was an actor, others said it was a role-playing game fan. But then details emerged. One historian, upon seeing the footage, said, "This isn't a modern reconstruction. This is a replica of 14th century armor, precise down to the riveting technique. They just don't make things like that in the US, especially with behavior like that." It was later discovered that archived newspapers from 1932 contained a note about a man seen on the roof of the Hotel Cecil, in dark armor, shining like a mirror. At the time, it was written off as an urban myth, but the coincidence is too precise. The date, the location, the description, and in that case, no one found out how he entered or left. Today, the Night of Cecil is an urban legend, but those who worked in the building at night say, sometimes you can hear something moving upstairs. Not like a person, like metal, sliding, inhale, pause, and then silence again. And if it really exists, then why does it appear? It doesn't attack. It doesn't speak. It doesn't signal. It just moves up, the roof, and disappears, as if checking the floor, or waiting for a command, for a signal, for a coincidence of dates. Maybe he's not guarding. Maybe he's the guardian of the glitch. He appears when something happens inside the building that shouldn't. And his presence isn't a threat, but a reaction. a mechanism that comes not from the past, but from a layer where time doesn't flow, but cyclically compresses. And Cecile is just an entry point, open on one side and only occasionally on the other. Blackout underground prison, hidden beneath the very center of London, in an area that today appears peaceful and civilized, lies a system of tunnels unmarked on public maps. These structures were originally built as air raid shelters during World War II. Then, according to official data, they were used to maintain telephone infrastructure. But there's a tunnel that isn't listed in the records. Its coordinates are known only to a limited number of people. Inside, according to those who once approached the zone, is what's known as the Blackout Prison, a place where they imprison not criminals, but information. The prison first came to light in an anonymous letter sent to a British scientific journal in 1998. The author claimed to have worked for the government security service and to have seen a facility housing people with unreliable psychophysics. The letter included a diagram of the underground complex, corridors, sealed areas, and 2 chambers, an acoustic chamber and a mirror chamber. The author insisted, however, that Blackout Prison had no security in the traditional sense. The inmates were isolated not by force, but by the structure of the space. Later, other sources began to confirm this information. Missing scientists, archivists, and military communications officers. They all hinted at a certain blank spot beneath the city, where something was happening that defied legal explanation. One of the most eerie details is the electrical behavior in this place. When attempting to install surveillance cameras in the dungeon, the devices refused to work. Some witnesses reported that lights flicker and compasses spin. Even the voice on the radio is delayed and distorted. It's as if the prison itself is jamming the surveillance, not blocking, but distorting. According to unconfirmed reports, Blackout contains people who have developed anomalous perceptions, the ability to hear ultrasound, see in complete darkness, and predict the appearance of radio interference. In some cases, there are outbursts of speech in languages they've never known. They're not treated. They're not interrogated. They're kept in mirror-covered cells, supposedly to reduce internal vibrations. In 2011, a map of the tunnels beneath Holborn was accidentally published in the city archives. 2 days later, the document disappeared. But a copy fell into the hands of researchers. It featured an unnamed tunnel leading to a dead end. A dead end in which stood a rectangle marked, "Observation temporarily suspended." Some believe that Blackout isn't protecting anyone. It's containing a malfunction. That there's no person inside the chamber but a distorted form. Something resulting from contact that shouldn't have happened. And if the doors are opened, something will start to sound. Or see. Some believe the tunnel will one day be discovered by chance, by builders, diggers, or mystery hunters. And if that happens, no one should speak to the first one to emerge, because they might not even know they've emerged. Or they might simply be the bearer of a silence someone has decided to seal away, but not forever. And archival footage of living dinosaurs in Africa. In 1983, an unknown videotape labeled Mokala Mbembe footage, Dija Reserve, entered the private collection of an American cryptozoologist. Its origin remained unclear. Its grainy 16mm film, clearly shot on an old camera, with no narration, just the hum of the jungle. And it has one sequence. For 43 seconds, the camera captures a huge figure slowly moving through shallow water among dense vegetation. The creature was massive, standing on 4 legs with a long neck and a thick, muscular back. Its head was small, with an elongated silhouette. Everything about it resembled a sauropod, just like in reconstructions of ancient prehistoric animals. Only it wasn't filmed in a museum, but in the real jungles of Central Africa. This is one of the most controversial pieces of evidence for the existence of a mythical creature called Mokala Mbembe, which means he who stops the river, in Lingala. References to it go back centuries. Local tribes describe it as a huge beast living in swampy areas, hiding from people, and capable of capsizing canoes and destroying anything that comes close to its territory. The scientific community is skeptical of these stories, but there are facts that persist. In 1913, German officer Ludwig Freiherr von Stein reported seeing a strange animal resembling a brontosaurus while traveling along a river. His report was classified, but fragments later surfaced in German archival publications. In 1966, a French missionary group claimed to have heard a dull growl at night and observed a huge silhouette breaking trees in the floodplain. The sound was recorded, but the tape was damaged, claimedly by humidity. In 2009, an American expedition involving naturalists from Canada returned empty-handed, but one of the participants committed suicide a month after the trip. Beforehand, he told friends, "Some creatures shouldn't be captured on camera because they're not here, but they're not gone either." The 1983 videotape itself was examined by imaging specialists. No editing was detected. The creature's size is comparable to that of an adult Indian elephant, but its proportions are different. There are no traces of humans in the frame. Only bird calls, the sound of water, and the cameraman's rapid breathing as if he were filming something he himself doesn't believe he's seeing. Today, this fragment is part of a closed archive with copies scattered among private collections. They refuse to make it publicly available due to copyright issues. But there are screenshots. There are descriptions. There is confirmation that in the jungle where no one lives, where there are no tourist routes, something enormous still breathes. Some believe Mokele-mbembe is not a surviving dinosaur, but a window into the past, a spatial seam through which a fragment of time can flow backwards. And then the creature isn't alive in the usual sense. It's a recording, trapped in space, a projection of biology, eluding time yet still visible, like an echo of an era that hasn't disappeared, but continues to resonate, only in places where no one will hear or dare admit they heard. To the cultists in Antarctica, 1965. The United Nations archives contain an undisclosed report from 1965, classified for internal use only. It mentions an incident that occurred during a joint international Antarctic expedition conducted in the Queen Maud Land region. Officially, it was a mission to study ice layers and meteorological conditions. Unofficially, it was a study of anomalies recorded near one of the oldest cracks in Antarctic ice, where equipment was transmitting signals that did not match natural resonances. According to the report, one of the 5-person teams abandoned camp without permission in the 7th week of the expedition. Their last radio contact was at 2:14 a.m. They spoke of light beneath the surface and whispers not in their ears, but in their bones. An attempt was made to retrieve them, but it was too late. Communication was lost. And 8 hours later, the team disappeared from radar. When they were found, only 4 days later, the tent was carefully pitched on the glacier, with no signs of storms or attack. There's not a single person inside, only notes. The notebooks contain diagrams, circles, and lines in Latin and Norwegian, but without any coherent meaning. On one page, we heard the first sound. It's under the ice. It's inside us. The camera's contents also raised alarm. Several images captured what appeared to be gigantic geometric structures beneath the ice surface. None of them were natural. Some resembled megaliths. Others were perfect circles, scorched or melted into a layer at least 15 meters deep. Local coordinators decided to end the mission. However, no details of the incident were made public. The incident was chalked up to a protocol violation, and the photographs disappeared from public records. Later, in 1973, one of the surviving members of the core group, Dr. Franz Werner, wrote a secret letter to a scientific journal in which he stated, "Some of those who had left returned, but they were not the same as those who had left. Their eyes were empty. They looked inward as if there was someone else inside. They were silent. They waited." Since then, all expeditions to the area have been strictly supervised by the military. Maps of the area are either obscured or contain false coordinates. Satellite images are blurry, as if there is a signal processing failure in the area. A hypothesis has emerged among ufologists and alternative historians. Antarctica may contain more than just a structure, an object emitting an effect incompatible with human perception, and that the cultists, as they were called in the reports, were not cultists in the traditional sense. They were primary perceivers, those who heard. And if even part of this is true, then the question isn't what they found beneath the ice, but what called them. And who was the first to understand that the peace of the ice sheets isn't silence, it's expectation, too ancient to be earthly, and too precise to be accidental. The mysterious wow signal. On August 15, 1977, at the Ohio State University Observatory, volunteer astronomer Jerry Emin was reviewing data logs from the Big Ear radio telescope. Suddenly, he spotted something that instantly stood out from all the other graphs. A narrow radio signal at 1420 megahertz, lasting 72 seconds. It was so powerful, clear, and unusual that Emin circled it in red pen on the printout and wrote on the side, "Wow." Thus began one of the most famous mysteries in the history of astronomy. The signal was coming from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, an area where there are no known stellar objects capable of emitting such a frequency. It matched the hydrogen line exactly, the frequency that scientists consider the most logical for transmitting interstellar messages because it is universal to all water-based life forms. The signal was incredibly concentrated, with a distinct onset, peak, and decline. It didn't repeat, it didn't flicker, it didn't waver, it simply sounded once, and then it was gone. No observatory in the world was able to detect it again. Scientists have attempted to explain it with natural sources, reflected satellite noise, a weather anomaly, a meteor. But none of these theories have stood up to scrutiny. The hydrogen line frequency is internationally prohibited for technical transmission. This means that no device on Earth should use it, especially not one with such power. The theory of extraterrestrial origin immediately sparked a storm of controversy. Some claimed it was a test signal, as if something or someone wanted to check whether someone was listening in return. After all, Big Ear was listening in at that moment, searching for alien signals. It was as if the recipient knew that at that moment there would be an ear. Since then, dozens of attempts have been made to listen to the same point, with different instruments, in different years, but nothing similar has ever been detected. Some speculate that the signal may have come not from a fixed point, but from an object passing by. In that case, we simply missed it. What's even stranger is the reaction of some authorities. A year after the data was published, one of the observatory's technicians reported that people had been coming into the building at night without officially identifying themselves. They checked the servers and removed old tapes. They said it was a routine check. But since then, some of the original data has been considered lost. Only paper copies remain. There are theories that the signal was a response, not random, but a reflection of something we ourselves once sent into space. A kind of ping, like in a radar system. We sent it, and it returned. Only, not to where we expected. And not from there. Today, wow, remains one of the few signals for which no rational explanation has been found. It's mentioned on every list of mysteries of the universe. It's become a meme, a symbol. But no one could decipher the signal itself, because perhaps it didn't carry a message. It was simply there, like a note, like a pulse, like a single fragment of presence, too brief to be captured, too precise to be forgotten. And if it was a voice, then it said everything it wanted to say with one sound, and then it fell silent, because it realized we weren't ready to answer yet. Or maybe we had already answered, but didn't realize it was a dialogue. SOS signal from a deserted island. In 2009, a group of amateur radio operators operating on 21.748 MHz intercepted a faint, barely audible signal resembling Morse code. It repeated every 18 minutes and contained the same pattern of dots and dashes, the International Distress Signal SOS. At first, they thought it was a training transmission or a random reflection, but the signal was too regular, too clear, and most importantly, always came from the same direction. His azimuth pointed to a region southeast of Madagascar, a stretch of the Indian Ocean with no permanent shipping lanes, underwater cables, or recorded radio stations. The nearest was a small uninhabited island called Île aux Serpents, Snake Island. It had no infrastructure, was unvisited by tourists, and was uninhabited. Satellite imagery revealed nothing unusual on the island. However, when an attempt was made to verify the location from the ground, the expedition failed. Several teams sent to the coordinates were turned back due to bad weather, navigational failure, and equipment malfunction. One boat reported that 30 miles from the island the compass began spinning, and the GPS returned an unknown zone error. Meanwhile, the signal continued to transmit, at the same rate, with the same power, every 18 minutes. Experts confirmed. The transmission was coming from analog equipment at a level typical of radio stations from the mid-20th century. This is what alarmed me most. Someone had to be constantly powering the source. There are no solar panels on that island, no towers, no automated beacons. So either the transmitter is autonomous, impossible for such a long time, or someone is still on the island. In 2012, a French engineer spoke at an international radar conference and stated, "This signal is not a request for help. It is a replica that continues without the sender's intervention." He suggested that a device abandoned long ago could continue transmitting in a loop driven by the energy of the wave itself, a rare effect known as a radio parasitic loop. But then another question arises. Who installed it? When? And why? The oldest recordings of a similar signal are in archives from 1971. Only then it was transmitted at a different frequency and with a different pulse length, as if it changed over time or adapted. The strangest thing, in 2015 the signal disappeared suddenly. No gradual weakening, just vanished. But exactly 72 hours later, a single pulse was detected on the same frequency, not an SOS, but a short fragment. This is not part of the Morse alphabet, but coincidentally, in Roman numerals, it can be read as the symbol K. It was never repeated. If this signal isn't noise, an error, or an atmospheric parasite, then we're dealing with a transmission system left behind by someone who knew Earth would someday be listening. And the island is simply an anchor, or a contact point, not for rescue, but to test the connection. And if it's lost, it might be because the connection was established, or conversely, there was no response. Sruchais woman without teeth, Norway. In November 1970, in Norway's Isdal Valley, an ice valley near the city of Bergen, a local fisherman walking along a trail came across the charred body of a woman. It lay among rocks, far from any settlements, in a place locals had long avoided. They called it Death Valley due to the many accidents and suicides there, but this case turned out to be much more mysterious. The woman was burned beyond recognition. Her clothes were half melted. Nearby were suitcases hidden under a rock. Inside were women's clothing, glasses without lenses, spoons with faded engravings, and bottles of a powerful sleeping pill. No passport, no personal items, no identification. All the tags had been cut off. An analysis of the body revealed unusual features. The woman had no teeth. All had been extracted, and in their place were expensive porcelain dentures, rare even by the standards of Western Europe in the 1970s. Traces of a sleeping pill were found in her stomach, but not a lethal dose. She was still alive when the fire started. The cause of death was smoke inhalation. In other words, she did not die instantly. A police investigation revealed that in the 2 weeks before her death, she stayed at several hotels under different names, registering at each with a new passport. Sometimes she spoke German. Sometimes she spoke English with an accent. Sometimes she spoke a language no one recognized. The staff described her as simultaneously elegant and alien. She always asked for a room by the window, and she often changed places. All documents provided upon check-in turned out to be fake. A letter written in a strange code, a sequence of numbers and letters that defied decipherment, was found. It was believed to be a system of roots or symbols. One of the strangest details, a small burnt note was found next to the body, with only 3 words remaining. Don't remember the face. The police considered many theories: suicide, murder, espionage. The latter seemed particularly convincing. It was 1970, the Cold War. Norway was a strategic point between the USSR and the USA. The woman moved like an agent. She changed her appearance. She avoided cameras. And then she disappeared. The way information carriers disappear, not individuals. But why burn yourself? Or who burned her? If it was liquidation, why was the body left in plain sight? Or was it, on the contrary, a warning? In 2005, an exhumation and reanalysis of the Isdal woman case was attempted. DNA technology, previously unavailable, was used. It was determined that she originated in Central Europe, possibly Austria or Yugoslavia. Nothing else. Her face was reconstructed. A 3D model was created. It was published. Not a single person, not a single database, produced a match. And then the question arose, what if she wasn't supposed to be identified? What if she existed not as a person, but as a function? Communication? Surveillance? Maybe she wasn't the first link, but the last. The one who was supposed to take the information and disappear. Burn herself to erase the route, remove the trace, put an end to the question. The strange book Codex Seraphinianus. In 1981, one of the most enigmatic books ever published was published in Rome, the Codex Seraphinianus, or Seraphinian Codex. The author was the Italian architect and designer Luigi Serafini. It looks like an encyclopedia of a fantasy world. Hundreds of pages, illustrations, diagrams, maps, anatomical charts, images of unknown creatures and mechanisms. Everything is executed in an incredibly detailed and academic style. But there's one peculiarity. The entire book is written in a fictional language, in an undecipherable font. Since the book's publication, no cryptographer, linguist, or artificial intelligence has been able to decipher it. The pages are littered with structured symbols, uppercase, lowercase, punctuation. But language has no lexical repetitions, which means either it doesn't lend itself to a familiar structure, or it's not a language, or language isn't for us. The book itself is divided into chapters like a true encyclopedia: flora, fauna, physics, sociology, technology. On one page are fish growing on trees, on another, a man transforming into a crocodile, and then into furniture. There are maps of non-existent countries. There are flight diagrams reminiscent of gravity engines, and all of this is presented not as art, but as a textbook. Serafini admitted in an interview that the book wasn't meant to be understood. He claims he created it while immersed in a trance-like state. He claimed that he didn't write the code. Rather, the code was dictated. This may sound like artistic exaggeration, but the fact is that the structure of the language is so rigorous and deliberate that the sensation of dictation seems more believable than a random collection of symbols. Some researchers believe that the code is an attempt to create a universal meta-language through which not a specific culture, but the very structure of consciousness itself can communicate. Others believe the book is borrowed from dreams and is a signal from another perception. There's even a hypothesis that the codex is an adapted artifact, rewritten by Serafini from something he found or received, but didn't explain. One of the most disturbing aspects. In 2013, a group of programmers, analyzing repetitions in the book's letters, discovered that some pages respond to others, as if the text contained dialogue scattered across different chapters. These repeating patterns are not linear, they are fractal, and they may be read not from left to right, but inward, in a spiral. The codex is still in print. Publishers release it as an art object, but not a single edition contains any explanations. All translations are merely attempts to describe the images, but the original text remains intact, and this no longer seems accidental. Rather, it seems imperative. Some believe the codex is not a book, but a key to what is unknown, to perception, to memory, to a different state of mind. Perhaps it wasn't created to be read, but to start a process. And if one day someone dreams of a page, not from the codex, but from before it, then the process has begun. Because perhaps the author didn't invent the alphabet. The alphabet chose its bearer. And now the book simply waits for someone to remember how to read, not by translating, but by hearing. Flight 914. On July 2nd, 1955, a Douglas DC-4 passenger jet departed New York International Airport, bound for Miami. There were 57 people on board, 4 crew members and 53 passengers. The weather was clear, and no technical malfunctions were reported. But a few minutes after takeoff, contact with the plane was lost. There was no distress signal, no deviation from course. It simply disappeared from radar. A massive search was launched. The suspected route, potential crash zones, even international borders were checked. Nothing, no debris, no fuel, not a single item indicating a disaster. The plane and its occupants were declared missing. Then, on September 9th, 1992, 37 years later, in Venezuelan airspace near Caracas, air traffic controllers detected an unidentified object entering the zone without permission. Communication was established with difficulty. The response was, "This is Flight 914 from New York, heading to Miami." At first, controllers thought it was a mistake or a cruel joke, but then an old 4-engine jet, similar to a DC-4, appeared on the screen. Its registration number was identical to that of the missing 1955 flight. The captain answered confidently, but used phrases and protocols from 50 years ago. There was no panic in his voice, only surprise. According to the pilot, only 1 hour had passed since takeoff. When controllers announced the date, and the fact that nearly 4 decades had passed, communication was lost. The plane abruptly changed course and disappeared from view. It was never seen again. Officially, the story is considered an urban legend, fueled by a series of newspaper articles supposedly based on interviews with eyewitnesses. But archival research shows that Flight 914 did indeed exist, and the disappearance date matches. Some of the passengers' names appear on missing persons lists, and to this day, they remain listed as missing. Photos of the plane, allegedly taken during the Caracas incident, have not been confirmed as authentic, but one former airport employee said in an interview, "It was like something from the past, even the smell, like old books. All the windows were open, people were looking out, and their faces were like those of people who had just taken off." Some theorists hypothesize that the plane entered a temporal anomaly, a kind of pocket in which time either stood still or slowed to zero. This may not have been intentional teleportation, but a function of space, manifested at a moment of coincidence, geographical, atmospheric, and energetic. Others believe the plane was part of an experiment involving time distortion. Perhaps its disappearance was not the result of a mistake, but rather an attempt to test the chronostructure. And when the plane returned, the system considered it a leak and deleted it. What's most frightening isn't that it appeared. It's that it disappeared again. Because if that's possible, if space can release the forgotten and take it back, then nothing disappears forever. It's just waiting for the right moment. And maybe there are already other flights in the sky, flying not according to schedule, but from memory. And one of them is already approaching. The mystery of Signal 112 Poland. On November 13, 2013, in southern Poland, near the town of Rzeszowicz, an emergency operator received an alarming call on 112. A child's voice was on the line. A girl, approximately 7 or 9 years old. She spoke quietly, restrained, repeating the same thing over and over. "He's in the room. I don't know how he got here. He's not talking." The operator tried asking the standard questions: where she was, who was with her, were there any adults nearby? But the girl responded only with short phrases. Every few seconds, the connection would be interrupted by static, then restored. 5 minutes into the call, she said, "He's looking at me, but he's not breathing." Then the line went dead. The automatic call location system revealed that the call had come from a wooded area with no houses nearby. Police and rescuers were dispatched immediately. They searched the area but found no phone, no child, no trace of human presence. Only at the edge of the forest in the snow stood a chair. Just one. A simple wooden one with no trace of where it had been carried. It was dry, unlike the ground. Even stranger, the number from which the call was made wasn't listed in the operator registry. It was an inactive SIM card registered to a non-existent name. Moreover, the station's log showed that the signal lasted longer than the actual call, and the call remained recorded even after the connection was disconnected. The next day, the operator who took the call volunteered to re-examine the area. He claimed that after the call, he began hearing the girl's voice in his sleep, repeating the same phrase. He was subsequently hospitalized with acute sleep disorder, deliriously repeating, "He's not moving, but he's already inside." An internal Polish police investigation concluded, false call, source unknown. However, one of the technical specialists saved the audio file. Subsequent analysis revealed low-frequency modulations in the background noise frequencies that were not typical of normal interference. Their structure resembled radar activation, as if the signal wasn't simply transmitted, but rather activated something on the receiving end. Some speculate it was an experiment, perhaps a psychophysical one. Some said the call could have been an information loop, an echo of an event that occurred in another timeline, but is spilling into the present. Others believe it wasn't a person making the call, but a system reproducing the voice, not out of compassion, but as an attention trap. Local residents still avoid that forest. They say they sometimes hear phone calls there that shouldn't be there. They say a slowly rotating light appears on the outskirts as if a screen is paused. They say electronics shut off, and that children playing nearby start repeating phrases that aren't their own, without understanding. And if this isn't a joke, a mistake, or malicious intent, then the 112 signal from the forest wasn't a request for help, but a marker of a place where the entrance was already open. Not to save someone, but to see who would answer, and how many times. Disappearance of Mikhail Demchenko, USSR. In November 1984, in a secret village in the Sverdlovsk region of the USSR, a facility known in archives as Point 12G, junior researcher Mikhail Demchenko disappeared. He worked in a research unit developing new materials with anomalous electromagnetic properties. Officially, he was involved in a crystal memory project. Unofficially, he was involved in a project related to recording unstable physical fields. On the day of his disappearance, Demchenko didn't show up for his shift. His room was locked from the inside. An unpacked change of clothes lay on the bed, and a cold mug of tea was on the nightstand. Everything was in place. Only one item was missing: the notebook with the notes he always kept with him. No one activated the access system to the premises. There are no camera recordings. As it later turned out, the magnetic tapes had been overwritten overnight, although there was no automatic overwriting. Security saw nothing. There are no signs of an exit. 48 hours after his disappearance, one of the lab engineers found a piece of paper on Demchenko's desk with a handwritten note. It's not him, and it's not me. It's between. The paper was confiscated, but a copy was kept in the shift supervisor's personal archive. He later claimed the inscription changed color every time he looked at it. It may sound like a hallucination, but he wasn't the only one who noticed it. The investigation lasted 2 months. Demchenko was never found. His disappearance was classified as possible desertion, despite the absurdity of the theory. He was loyal, hard-working, and had no reason to disappear. All his work records were classified. But later, in 1991, during the release of the archives, something interesting emerged. In one of the closed volumes, it was not his name that appeared, but Demchenko, Phase 2, as if they were looking not for a person, but for a fortune. Those who worked with him reported strange things, that he complained of a shift in time perception, as if the clock in his room were lagging behind the outside world, that he saw shadows that didn't correspond to objects, that he felt a pressure on the air, as if space were becoming viscous. His colleagues assumed this was due to fatigue, but now they're not so sure. It later emerged that the laboratory where Demchenko worked was conducting experiments with structures that simulated a closed time loop at the microscopic level. They called it a time cell, an area in which 1 second could be captured, slowed down, and observed in isolation. The experiments were considered failures. But what if one of them got out of control? Ghosts on TV. In October 1979, in St. Petersburg, Florida, residents' television screens in the area experienced a brief, unexpected interruption for 3 consecutive nights. This occurred during the regular evening news broadcast at approximately 9:53 p.m. The signal would jump for a split second. The screen would go dark, and then a fragment would appear. A camera, static-filled, showed a windowless room where a man in dark clothing sat. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He just stared into the lens. Then the image would disappear, and the regular broadcast would continue as if nothing had happened. Local television station WNTB was unable to explain the glitch. For all 3 evenings, the technical department recorded a completely stable signal and no external interference. Archived recordings of the broadcast contained no inserts, even on tapes with direct duplicates of the signal. Only home VCRs, manually recording the broadcast, preserved the moment. All showed the same fragment, the same parameters. The Federal Communications Commission conducted an investigation. No violations were found. However, one engineer admitted to reporters off the record that the insertion was not through the broadcast channel, but rather from within the receiver. This is technically impossible. But each home where the insertion was recorded used different antennas, different TV models, and different providers. There was nothing in common. One VHS camera owner, after reviewing the footage frame by frame, discovered fuzzy but clearly legible symbols in the final frame before the figure disappeared. They didn't correspond to the alphabet, but resembled a mixture of Cyrillic, Latin, and mathematical symbols. Later, researchers compared them with fragments of text from Old Slavic magical formulas for expelling trapped souls. A few weeks later, the strange occurrences continued. Several WNTB staffers complained of headaches, insomnia, and the feeling of remembering someone else's life. One editor was hospitalized after seeing the same figure not on screen, but in a reflection in the black panel of the monitor. In 1980, the television company underwent an internal renovation and replaced all its equipment. Since then, the installation has not been repeated, but the tapes containing the recordings disappeared. Only digital copies remain, passed between paranormal researchers. Some believe it was a hacker attack. Others believe an unknown experimental attention manipulation program is behind it. There's a more disturbing theory, that the image wasn't implanted but rather made possible by a frequency match between the television signal and a specific atmospheric condition. It's as if the signal wasn't transmitted, but manifested, from a different range of perception. And what we saw on the screen wasn't a transmission. It was an observation from the other side. And perhaps whoever was watching from inside the room wasn't trying to scare anyone. They were simply testing where and when the boundary between signal and vision became thin enough for them to be seen. Not as an obstacle, but as a reminder that the ether isn't a void. It's a layer, and someone knows how to enter it, without noise, without hacking, simply through the eye. Mysterious carving on mummy's body in Peru. In 1988, an archaeological team from Lima was conducting a routine excavation in the desert region of Nazca at one of the inconspicuous burial sites belonging to the Paracas culture. Among dozens of ordinary finds, they unearthed a cloth-wrapped body. Everything pointed to standard mummification: the tight posture, the plant fibers, the coiled form. But when the body was uncovered, archaeologists noticed something that didn't fit with any known burial practices in the region. On the left side of the mummy's chest, beneath the ribs, was a perfectly symmetrical cut, approximately 7 centimeters deep. Its shape resembled an oval, with clear, even edges, as if the body tissue had not been torn or cut, but rather excised in a single instant, as if by a laser. There were no cracks in the skin or signs of decomposition around it. Everything looked as if the incision had been made posthumously, but without any crude instrument. No organs were found inside the oval. The cavity was empty, the walls smooth and shiny, as if the tissue had been heat-treated. Around the opening were tiny incisions, reminiscent of surgical incisions. But microscopic analysis revealed that no known instrument could have produced such a mark. Moreover, the mummy's skin was intact throughout the rest of the body. Scientists attempted to explain the anomaly as a ritual manipulation associated with religious rites, but similar features had not been observed in other mummies in the region. No comparable finds were found. Moreover, under ultraviolet light, the fabric in the area of the cutout began to glow faintly, as if it contained substances that were not detected by ordinary chemicals. They tested for metals, carbon compounds, and even traces of minerals, all negative. Then one of the samples was sent to a private lab in Germany. The result astonished everyone. The tissue structure in the incision area had an abnormally dense collagen structure, characteristic not of humans, but of tissues that had undergone artificial reconstruction. This could not have been present in a body that had lain in the ground for over 2,000 years. Later, one of the scientists involved in the expedition said in a private conversation that the discovery had frightened the entire team. They couldn't figure out what exactly they were holding. He said it felt like the cutout wasn't just a mark, but an interface, an attempt to open something inside the body, or extract it, but not at the organic level, rather at an access point that someone has already used. After the initial analysis, access to the mummy was restricted. It was not displayed in the museum. It was not published in scientific journals. The archives fell silent. Only years later did fragments of information begin to surface in alternative historian circles. Some believe the carving was made by representatives of another civilization, not extraterrestrial, but ancient earthly, possessing technology capable of manipulating matter at the cellular level. Others are certain it's not a mummy at all, but a host, a shell from which something important was extracted. Not a heart, not an organ, but a memory, a code, or even a voice. The deserts of Peru are home to many burial sites. Many of them are standard. But sometimes, something is discovered that doesn't fit into the chronology. That doesn't align with the cultural background. And it evokes, not superstition, but an unsettling clarity, because it's too precise, too smooth, too silent. If this discovery wasn't an accident, then it had a purpose. Perhaps the body wasn't dissected by humans. Perhaps it lay here as a beacon, a checkpoint, and the cut as a place where something once entered or exited. Exactly. Without a trace, without explanation, just a cut and emptiness inside. The unexplained death of Kenneth Arnold. Kenneth Arnold made history as the first person to publicly report seeing flying saucers. On June 24, 1947, while piloting his private plane over the Cascade Mountains of Washington, he spotted 9 objects flying at unnatural speeds and moving like pebbles bouncing on water. This incident marked the beginning of the entire American UFO era. However, few people know that decades after this event, Arnold died under extremely strange circumstances, and everything related to his latest research was quickly and completely deleted. By 1984, Arnold had retired from active flying, but continued to collect evidence of anomalous objects traveling across the country. In 1983, he announced that he was working on a classified report that would summarize everything he had learned over the decades. He mentioned that his archive contains materials provided by former military personnel and radio operators, including evidence of signals matching the frequency of noise recorded in low Earth orbit. A few months before his death, he told a journalist that he was preparing a presentation demonstrating some visual evidence obtained back in the 1950s but withheld at the request of an agency. He was certain that his saucers were neither Soviet nor natural phenomena, but rather represented technologies whose logic lay beyond the conventional laws of aerodynamics. In May 1984, Arnold was found dead in his Idaho home. The cause of death was a heart attack, but in the room where he worked, all the documents had been removed. The safe was open. The audio reels were empty. His notebook with its encrypted notes was gone. Relatives claim that just the day before he had appeared completely healthy, but in the last weeks before that, he had felt pressure, not physical but psychological, as if someone was watching. The only surviving tape is a fragment of an interview in which Arnold utters a strange phrase: "Some things are not made to be understood. They are made to be present." Later, one of the former BBC employees, who worked with ufologists at the time, claimed that Arnold had indeed collected unique material, including patterns of movement of objects with coincidences at different times and in different parts of the planet. All the trajectories converged at a single node, an area of the Pacific Ocean southwest of the Aleutian Islands. This location, he said, systematically distorts radio waves and produces sourceless bursts of light. The question that still haunts researchers is not only that Arnold died before publication, but that everything he collected disappeared. There was no break-in. His family couldn't open his safe. But when they opened it, they discovered it was empty, but undamaged. It was as if the contents had vanished without being opened. Or perhaps they weren't physically there, but someone knew where they were supposed to be. If Arnold was truly getting closer to solving the mystery, perhaps he had crossed the line where the observed object becomes the observer. In that case, the saucers he spoke of in 1947 were not the beginning, but an invitation to a route that never flew in a straight line, and which ends not in the sky, but inside the person who decided to listen to the silence beyond the clouds. The mystery of the disappearance of Malaysian flight MH370. On March 8, 2014 at 12:41 a.m. local time, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, a Boeing 777-200ER operating from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, took off with 239 people on board. 40 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft stopped responding to flight control. No distress signal, no navigational failure, no standard response. Communication vanished instantly. And so began one of the most mysterious disasters in the history of modern aviation. The initial search focused on the South China Sea along the suspected route, but it soon became clear that the plane had abruptly changed course, turning southwest and crossing the Strait of Malacca. This was confirmed by military radar. After this, MH370 disappeared from the news for good. A few days later, it was revealed that satellite signals had been interpreted to show that the plane continued flying for another 6 hours after losing contact, heading toward the southern Indian Ocean. This was impossible. The airliner shouldn't have been in that area. There was only enough fuel to last until the end of the flight. The plane's signal continued to reach Inmarsat satellites, short handshakes every hour. The last one was received at 8:19, meaning the plane had been flying for almost 7 hours in an unknown direction. What happened on board remains unknown to this day. Theories include hijacking, a crash, and deliberate action by the pilot. But none of them explain the disappearance of the entire aircraft. No debris, no floating objects, no radio communications. It wasn't until 2015 that a wing fragment, presumably from MH370, was found on Reunion Island. Several more pieces of debris were later found, but their identity hasn't been fully proven. The airframe itself, the black boxes, and the remains remain missing. There are accounts that are not officially recognized. One civil aviation pilot claimed that while flying over the southern Indian Ocean, he spotted an inexplicable dense blip on radar moving against the wind at incredible speed. Other reports pointed to anomalies in the satellite transmission, fragments of a distorted signal that seemed to rewrite its own route. Some researchers believe the disappearance is linked to a non-classical phenomenon in geophysics, a kind of radio-silent funnel, an area where coordinates and time parameters can become distorted. Such hypotheses sound fantastic, but the question remains, if the plane flew for 6 hours after losing contact, why didn't any country on the route record its flight visually or by radar? There was a theory that the plane was deliberately removed, that it was removed from global tracking. But this would require technology capable of simultaneously deceiving aircraft, military systems, and satellites. This isn't just a conspiracy. It's an operation that couldn't be carried out without access to structures outside of government institutions. Or, conversely, no one turned anything off. The plane simply left the accessible layer of perception, as if it continued to exist, but outside the coordinate grid. And then it doesn't matter where it crashed. What matters is that it went beyond the frame. And if that's the case, the question is no longer what happened, but who else might get there. And when. The voice that stopped the plane, August 20th, 1980, Narita Airport, Tokyo. A Japanese airliner was preparing for takeoff to Osaka. There were 144 passengers on board. Everything was proceeding as planned. The runway was clear, weather conditions were favorable, and the controller had given clearance for takeoff. At that moment, a voice came over the plane's radio that shouldn't have. He uttered only 2 phrases. First in Japanese, "Stop, he's already inside." Then in English, "Abort." The voice sounded smooth, without distortion, but it couldn't be detected by any radio station. The crew was stunned. The captain decided to abort the takeoff. The plane stopped seconds before takeoff. At first, it was dismissed as a technical glitch or a joke, but analysis of the recordings revealed that the signal didn't come from outside. It didn't pass through the antenna. It originated inside the cabin, as if it were built into the system. No ground transmitters detected the transmission. Moreover, the airline confirmed that this route didn't intersect with other flights at the time. There was no interception. 2 hours after the flight was canceled, an inspection of the same aircraft revealed a crack in the right engine mount, which could have led to a mid-air crash. Officially, this led to the accident being labeled a preventable incident. But it remains unclear who could have known about this in advance. An internal investigation began immediately. Everyone involved, from technicians to pilots, was checked. No anomalies were found in the communications equipment. Even the radio transmitter unit was found to be disconnected at the time of the signal. The cockpit voice recorder itself recorded the phrases, but without interference, without hissing, at the perfect audio frequency characteristic of a studio recording. Later, one of the pilots in the cockpit said the voice seemed familiar, not in its content, but in its intonation. It felt like it was not his own, but from within, as if he'd heard his own thoughts, spoken by a different voice. Rumors spread quickly. Newspapers dubbed the incident spiritual intervention and a voice from heaven. Officially, the information was not commented on. But years later, in the closed archives of the Japanese Civil Aviation Agency, it was discovered that this was not the first such incident. In 1973, while preparing for takeoff on another flight, a warning was heard in the cockpit. "They're waiting up there. Don't fly." The crew ignored it. The plane crashed 40 minutes after takeoff. Cause: engine failure. The circumstances remain disputed. Some speculate that this isn't mysticism, but rather a temporal signal blockage, as if part of the future entered the communication system, or as if the pilot's consciousness in an extreme situation activated anomalous perception, hearing something that wasn't heard, but should have been. If the voices were real, who sent them? And if they weren't real, how did they know something no one else knew? Perhaps it's not the voice that matters, but the moment when a decision must be made, but one cannot. Then something else is activated. Not language, not a warning, but a corridor, through which comes not a distress signal, but a choice. Between routes, between outcomes, between lives that have already taken the same path, and those who may yet stop. The double disappearance of Linda and Christina Morrison. In 1997, an event occurred in Oregon that remains unexplained. Linda Morrison, 34, and her daughter Christina, 11, left their home in the small town of Springfield around 9 a.m. They were heading to a nearby shopping center. According to witnesses, they got into their car, drove onto the highway, and vanished forever. Not a single camera, not a single call, not a single transaction after leaving the house. No body, no car, no trace. Initial theories centered on a runaway. But Linda was known as a responsible mother, worked as an accountant at a city clinic, had a stable income, was not in debt, and had no enemies or criminal connections. Her daughter was an excellent student, with no signs of depression or problems. The house was in order. Food was on the stove. The iron was turned off. The entire walk to the shopping center took no more than 20 minutes. The police began combing the highways, bodies of water, fields, and forests. There were no skid marks, no traces of the car. In the area where Linda must have been, the traffic surveillance system detected an anomaly. For 17 seconds, the cameras recorded a gap in the image. The image shook, blurred, and then stabilized. During this interval, there wasn't a single car. The traffic jumped forward as if a segment of the recording had been cut out, or the time structure had shifted. 3 weeks after the disappearance, a truck driver reported seeing a woman and child resembling Linda and Christina at a gas station in Idaho. He claimed they were standing at a soda machine but were acting strange, as if they didn't understand how it worked. When he approached, they had turned the corner. The gas station security camera footage shows only silhouettes, blurred, as if out of focus. Not a single face is recognizable. Then, silence. For 10 years, no trace. Until 2007, when an internet user posted anonymously on a forum describing a woman in a gray jacket staring in one direction for 3 hours at a forest campsite. He claimed he approached her, but she remained unresponsive, as if looking through everything. When he blinked, she was gone. It's suspicious that the username, K1997LM, contains initials and the date of disappearance. The account's address is registered in Canada. The account was deleted 2 days later. The forum was closed a month later. Researchers of anomalous phenomena hypothesized that this could be a phenomenon of temporal rifts, in which a specific point in space briefly loses synchronization with the rest of the world. Those who enter this rift don't die, but are instead transported. Not to another place, but to a non-time, from which one can see the world, but not enter it. If that's true, Linda and Christina haven't disappeared. They're simply standing in another layer on the same track, the same route, and waiting. Or not waiting. Just watching. Because maybe they're still here. Only no one can reach through the minute that was shifted by someone or something that knows how the route works, but doesn't explain why it needs to be interrupted at this precise moment. Ghosts of Belmes, faces on the floor. In August 1971, in the small Spanish town of Belmes de la Moraleda, the Pereira family noticed a strange stain on their kitchen floor. It seemed as if a face had emerged from the cement tiles, with vague but recognizable features, eyes, mouth, eyebrows. At first, they thought it was a stain from moisture or soot and tried to wipe it off. But the stain didn't disappear, and after a few days it only became clearer. And then new ones appeared. On the walls, on the floor, even under the furniture, dozens of faces, none identical, as if each figure were an individual. Rumors spread instantly. The house became a place of pilgrimage. Scientists, journalists, and paranormal researchers flocked to verify its authenticity. Experiments were conducted. Sections of the cement were painted over, covered, sealed under glass. But after a few weeks, the faces returned, sometimes different, sometimes the same, but with altered expressions. There were even photographs where the faces changed over time, as if they were aging, as if they were watching. Chemical analysis of the surface revealed no traces of pigments, dyes, or chemicals. In one case, when a tile was removed and taken to a lab in Madrid, the image began to disappear. But a day later, it reappeared, in a different location in the house, on the ceiling under the stairs. It was as if the meaning of the images lay not in the material, but in the very structure of the space. Authorities considered the possibility of a hoax. The Pereira family was accused of forgery, but no expert could replicate the effect. Furthermore, the facial lines continued uninterrupted even through newly poured concrete. Geophysicists suggested a burial site might be located beneath the house. During excavations, human remains were discovered, without coffins or burial goods. They were approximately 400 years old. The bones were removed. But faces continued to appear. Later, one of the researchers who worked in the house for a month described how at a certain time of day, complete silence descends. Even the sounds of the street seem to fade away. And in this silence, the images begin to change. He noticed that some faces repeat themselves like a cycle, as if returning in a certain sequence. And once, at night, he claimed that the face on the wall moved an eyelid. Some believe that Belmes is a place of memory, where the space captures not just death, but the tension of emotions, fear, and pain, frozen in the structure of the building. Not ghosts in the usual sense, but emotional traces, emerging from dense matter, like images on developed film. Others suggest the house has fallen into a temporal knot, where the past doesn't fade away, but seeps through. And these faces aren't dead, but rather those living around, in another layer of perception. And when the boundary between the layers becomes thin, they look outward. The house in Belmes still exists. The faces appear less frequently, but they haven't disappeared completely. Sometimes they return years later with different expressions. And if you find yourself there, don't look for them. Just stop and wait, because they're already looking. And maybe one of the figures wasn't there before. But now it won't go away. A signal from under the Arctic ice, Sleeping Titan. In 2010, a research vessel monitoring tectonic activity in the Arctic detected an unusual low-frequency signal coming from beneath deep ice layers off the Greenland shelf. At first, it was mistaken for a seismic tremor, but the signal didn't have the characteristic structure of ground vibrations. It was steady, pulsating, like the beating of a giant heart, and repeated at regular intervals. The signal was recorded by 4 different stations scattered over hundreds of kilometers. Its amplitude was stable, and its frequency was below the threshold of human hearing. Meanwhile, sensitive equipment began to overheat, despite an outside temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. After 23 hours of broadcasting, the signal suddenly stopped, as if someone had switched it off. When scientists attempted to approach the source, the icebreaker encountered an unexpected obstacle. A probe launched into an ice crack transmitted an image showing a structure below, resembling a rounded rock surface, but with a symmetrical geometric pattern, as if something there was not natural. Officials halted further exploration, citing the route's danger. Internal reports leaked to the press spoke of an undefined density structure and used the term stable resonant activity of unknown origin. Later, a former project employee who wished to remain anonymous stated that within 2 weeks of the signal being turned off, anomalous ice domes began to appear in some areas of the shelf. They were perfectly round, crack-free, and had a temperature 15 degrees higher than the ambient temperature. They were soon leveled with the surface, but before that, secondary vibrations, similar to an echo from within, were recorded from the surface of one of these anomalies. Some researchers have dubbed the signal's source the Sleeping Titan, as if something ancient, buried deep within the planet, had now given a brief sign of activity. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of its presence. Some theories suggest this is an ancient man-made structure left long before the existence of modern civilization, or conversely, a geo-organism existing in a slow phase of life, in which a single breath can last a century. In that case, the signal isn't communication, but rather part of an awakening. If so, the question isn't what this object is. The question is why it signaled now. And if it was sleeping, what was its wake-up call? Perhaps something in the world changed, or someone called it. Or perhaps we just happened to be on the same frequency it's been listening to all this time. And then the silence in the Arctic isn't emptiness. It's the interval between awakenings, between beats that never repeat, but always lead to the same thing, the moment when he hears us or wants us to hear him. The mystery of the man in the iron mask. The story of a mysterious prisoner imprisoned in a French prison in the 17th century and wearing an iron or velvet mask remains one of the darkest mysteries in European history. No one ever identified him by name. He never appeared in public. His identity was strictly confidential, and everyone who came into contact with him signed an oath of silence. His captors didn't know who they were guarding. Only one thing was clear. He was dangerous not as a criminal, but as a fact of his existence. Arrested around 1669 and transferred to several prisons, including the famous Bastille, the masked prisoner lived in complete isolation for almost 30 years. There is no written evidence of his origin. All official papers and reports were destroyed or redacted, but some fragments survive. One note reads, "He must not speak, not a word, and must not be identified even after death." There have been numerous theories about his identity. The illegitimate brother of King Louis XIV, the heir to the throne, hidden, a general who knew too much, but none have been confirmed. The body was buried under a false name. The grave was unmarked. The skull was missing. The strangest thing happened later. In 1794, a century after his death, a French archivist discovered a room behind the false wall of the Bastille that no one knew about. Inside is a void and an engraving on the stone. "He who saw is silent. He who knew is not alive." This fragment was carved into the stone in a mirror-like manner, as if intended to be read through reflection. In the 19th century, writer Victor Hugo hinted at the existence of a manuscript written by a masked man, but no one had ever seen it. Some claim the text was not in French, but in a special cipher, with letters replaced by symbols. One of the supposed decipherers later disappeared. There's a theory that the masked man wasn't a political threat, but rather a bearer of knowledge that couldn't be destroyed, but couldn't be allowed to spread either. Perhaps he witnessed some encounter, phenomenon, or event that undermined the foundations of the world at that time. And then the mask is not a means of humiliation, but an isolating device, not only from the eyes, but also from words. Some researchers believe the mask may have been made not of iron, but of lead with internal inserts. Such masks were used in alchemical rituals to seal information. And if the person wearing the mask held not a name but an image, then perhaps their purpose was not to remain silent, but to retain that which could not be expressed. He died, but he didn't forget. Because if the truth is even a step closer, then his existence wasn't a mistake. It was a structural protection against leakage. And then the one wearing the mask wasn't a prisoner, but a guardian. And the question isn't who he was, but what was stored within him. And was it ever extracted? Or is it waiting for the next wearer? To the dagger, fights with strange symbols. In 1933, on the banks of the Kennebec River in Maine, USA, a boy named Benjamin Duggar found a dark, smooth stone partially buried in the sand. The stone was an elongated oval and weighed just under a kilogram. Carved into its surface were symbols unlike any known alphabet. These were curved, sharp, and twisted lines, forming a structure resembling a cipher or an ancient map. The boy's family preserved the find and donated it to a local museum, unaware that decades later, the artifact would become the subject of a real investigation. Scientists who studied the stone in the 1950s were unable to assign it to any archaeological layer in the region. The engravings were too precise, the edges of the cuts perfectly smooth, as if they had been made with a tool cutting molecules rather than stone. The stone itself turned out to be made of volcanic rock, which is not found within a radius of hundreds of miles. In 1971, a cryptographer and professor at Brown University attempted to decipher the symbols by treating them as a written language. He concluded that the structure resembled a programming language, only not linear but fractal, in which the symbols represent not letters, but modulated meanings. His work was never published, but drafts have survived. They contain a phrase underlined in red. He does not speak, he calls. Legend has it that in the 1980s, after the stone was exhibited in a traveling exhibition, 3 visitors reported a recurring dream in which they stood on the shore and stone figures rose from the water. The 3 were strangers, but they described the same landscape: a smooth, flooded shore, a huge star in the sky, and a shadow underwater. In 1996, the stone disappeared. Officially, it was lost in transit. In reality, the expedition transporting the collection claimed that when unloading the crate containing the artifact, its weight was 1.7 kilos lighter than expected. Neither the lid nor the locks were damaged. All the objects inside were still there, except for one thing: the stone. Later, counterfeits, copies with the same symbols, began to appear in private collections, but none had the same resonant frequency that the instruments recorded when brought close to the original. Because, yes, the stone had its own sonic response, recorded by ultrasound, short pulses that matched the delta wave modulations of the human brain. Some believe the Dagger Boy stone is an artifact left as a test contact, a piece of code to be found and read, not with words, but with perception. Perhaps the symbols aren't text, but an activation system. And the stone itself isn't a relic, but a trigger, setting off an event not in place, but in time. As if, when you stare at it for too long, it doesn't wait for you to understand. It waits for you to respond. Departure of the crew of the ship Carroll A. Deering. In January 1921, the 2-masted schooner Carroll A. Deering was discovered washed ashore at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The vessel was upright, with no hull damage, and her sails were partially raised but not operational. However, not a single crew member was aboard. Everyone was gone. The captain, the officers, the sailors. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no bodies. Only a strange, silent emptiness enveloped the vessel. The ship was new, built in 1919, and well-equipped. Several days before its disappearance, the crew had been spotted in ports, and all seemed normal. But on the last day of navigation, the captain sent a short message. Officers are acting strangely. Intervention required. Immediately afterward, communication was lost. When the Coast Guard boarded, they found the helm secured, the cabins neatly tidied, and the food prepared. A kettle was boiling in the galley. Chairs stood in the wardroom, one of them overturned. The ship's log was gone. The boats were missing. All the clocks had stopped at the same time. But what was especially striking was the discovery in the captain's cabin. An open map of the Atlantic on which something resembling a loop encircling the Bermuda Triangle had been drawn in pencil, even though the triangle itself wasn't yet part of the public consciousness. In the margins was a note: return impossible. They won't let go. Experts attempted to explain the crew's disappearance: a storm, piracy, mutiny, drowning. But none of the theories were supported by the facts. The weather was stable. The cargo on board remained intact. And the boats were never found, even years later. It was later discovered that a week before the Carol A. Deering's disappearance, it had docked at a port where crew members reported strange behavior from one of the sailors. He claimed to hear creaking sounds at night, not from the wood, but from inside his head. He wrote symbols in his notebook that resembled old navigational codes, but with shifts. One day, he claimed that the ship isn't moving forward, but is sailing in circles in its sleep. There were rumors that this wasn't the first such incident in the region. Archives contain references to other ships discovered in the same waters, silently drifting, empty, with a barely audible hum in their hulls, as if the metal resonated with something not outside, but within the route itself. Some believe that Carol A. Deering passed through an anomalous time warp zone in which consciousness loses synchronicity with physical space. People disappear not as bodies, but as structures of perception, leaving behind only the shadow of their presence. Or perhaps a route has been disrupted, an invisible threshold crossed, beyond which the sea no longer returns. The ship was burned a month later so as not to attract attention. But the rumor lingered. And if you find yourself on the coast of Cape Hatteras on a particularly quiet night, they say you can hear the whisper of canvas emerging from the fog, as if someone is still trying to turn back, only not to the shore anymore, but to the moment where everything disappeared. The sounds of the noise of the earth are a global phenomenon. Since the early 2010s, strange sound phenomena have been reported around the world. A low-frequency hum coming from nowhere, resembling a roar, a mechanical hum, or a distant trumpet. It has been given various names: the hum of the earth, the call of metal, and the hum of heaven. But the essence is the same. The sound arises in the complete absence of a source, lasts from a few seconds to half an hour, and disappears as suddenly as it appeared. It is heard simultaneously in different places: in northern Canada, Mexico, Russia, Germany, Australia. Sometimes synchronously, sometimes with an interval of days, but with an absolutely identical spectrum. Recordings of the phenomenon posted online are garnering millions of views. People describe it as something between pipes and breathing, a vibration that enters the chest, a sound that makes you want to stop and not move. Some experience fear, others experience nausea and headaches. Some hear nothing, but devices detect bursts of infrasound at that moment. Scientists have put forward theories such as atmospheric resonances, microseisms, and man-made sources. However, in some cases, the sound originated in locations remote from cities, without geological disturbances, and in complete silence. None of these hypotheses explains why the sound spectrum is virtually identical despite the geographical differences. One day in Canada, a group of specialists attempted to point highly sensitive microphones toward a sound source, but the instruments recorded not the direction, but the entire space. It was as if the sound wasn't emitted, but originated within the perception. Analysis of the recordings showed that the structure of the hum is not random. It contains a modulation with a specific rhythm, similar to the frequency of alpha brainwaves in a state of anxiety. In some cases, animals left the area before the sound appeared, birds fell silent, and pressure surges were recorded in the atmosphere. In others, the sound occurred in complete isolation, inside houses, as if it wasn't coming from outside, but rather turned on inside. One woman in Finland claimed to hear the sound right in her pillow, only there, and nowhere else. There have been cases where the hum has been accompanied by electrical failures, GPS shutdowns, and even demagnetization of compasses. These phenomena have been recorded but not explained. Infrasound wave, inconsistent, tectonic activity, no epicenters, secret projects, too global, too chaotic. Some theorists believe that the noise of the earth is the voice of the planet itself, not metaphorically, literally. That vibrations exist within the core that become audible under certain conditions. Others believe it is an attempt at communication, either with us or between other structures outside the human circuit. There's a third theory, the most disturbing one, that it's not a sound, but an activation. That at this moment the world becomes accessible to something on the other side, and that the sound isn't a sign of a malfunction, but a signal that the door is open. And then the noise of the earth is not a natural phenomenon. It is the whisper of a system we mistakenly thought was silent, too quiet to speak, and too distant to listen, until it decided to begin. The mystery of the Mary King's Mirror in Edinburgh. Hidden beneath the stone streets and ornate arches of Edinburgh's Old Town lies a subterranean level, the so-called Close Mary Kings, that was once buried and forgotten. It was reopened to visitors in the late 20th century and converted into a museum. But among all the stories associated with this place, one frightens even the complex's employees. It's a mirror standing in the former living room, where, rumor has it, Mary King herself stayed. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary rectangular mirror in an antique frame, but more than a dozen documented cases have been associated with it. Visitors have complained of nausea, disorientation, and a sudden feeling of fear. Some said they saw someone else in the reflection, not themselves, not a ghost, not a shadowy figure. A clear image of a person looking straight into their eyes, but not mirroring their movements. Experiments conducted with thermal imaging and IR cameras revealed no anomalies. However, one of the researchers noted that the mirror did not fully reflect light, appearing to partially absorb it, especially at the edges. The inner layer of the amalgam was unusually dense, containing a substance uncharacteristic of glass of that era. Analysis revealed the presence of a thin metallic layer containing silver and bismuth compounds, an extremely rare combination not used in mirror production. History has it that the mirror had been in the house since the 17th century. In 1645, during the plague, the mistress of the house died in that very room, in front of the mirror. Local legends claim that she refused to leave the house to avoid infecting others and died in isolation. After her death, the mirror was covered and not removed for almost 100 years. When the mirror was returned to the exhibition, strange occurrences began immediately. In 1997, a French tourist left in panic, claiming to have seen his daughter standing behind him. The problem is, he arrived alone. Later, cameras captured him looking in the mirror, taking a step back and falling. There's footage, but there's no one behind him. While cleaning the exhibits, the dungeon workers try to avoid looking at the reflection. One of the caretakers admitted that at a certain time of day, around 4:33 p.m., the mirror becomes cloudy, as if fogged up from the inside. But the temperature in the room remains constant. Some believe Mary King's mirror isn't an object but a window, a point where two layers of time overlap. And what appears in it aren't spirits, but alternative observers. Those on the other side are trying to understand who we are, what we look like, and when we're vulnerable. And then the question isn't what you see in the reflection, but when the reflection stops being you and becomes someone who has been watching for too long. And one day, it will want to look outside, not through the glass anymore, but straight ahead, through you. The Devil's Library, Codex Gigas. The Royal Library of Sweden houses one of the most mysterious manuscripts in history, the Codex Gigas, or Giant Book. This is the largest medieval book in the world, almost a meter tall and weighing over 70 kilograms. It is crafted from 160 donkey skins, contains 620 pages, and is written in a perfectly even hand, without any visible irregularities, no drafts, no edits. It's as if it were written by one hand, and in one breath. The book dates back to the 13th century. According to monastery legend, it was written by a Benedictine monk sentenced to death for an unnamed crime. To avoid execution, he promised to create a book in one night that would contain all of human knowledge. When midnight struck, he realized he was running out of time. And as the story goes, he summoned the devil himself to help him finish the job. The deal was struck. And in the center of the book, occupying an entire page, stands a single image of a figure, a huge demon, drawn with anatomical precision but without a trace of fear. He doesn't frighten. He watches. Inside is the complete Old Testament, medical treatises, alchemical diagrams, laws, stories of fallen angels, advice on exorcism and magical practices. Everything is written in the same handwriting, as if the author had never paused. Scientists have analyzed the ink. It is identical on every page. This is impossible without repreparation. But here, not a single color is different. More importantly, between some chapters there are blank pages, perfectly inscribed but without text. Their purpose is unknown. Some experts claim these are missing chapters, but others believe the pages are activated by certain lighting or temperature conditions. Several attempts to heat them under IR lighting revealed the appearance of slight shadows, as if the text was hidden deep within the layer. The book's physical condition is unique. The leather cover doesn't crack despite its age. The paper doesn't dry out. Restorers claim the book feels not like paper, but like living material. Some are afraid to touch it. What's particularly strange is that there's a pause in the book's content. Between sections, there's a gap of several dozen pages, devoid of words, only patterned lines along the edges, like a pulse. Some claim that if you stare at them long enough, a rhythm emerges, a heartbeat, whose rhythm no one knows. The Codex Gigas was never copied. No complete copy exists. Those who attempted to digitize it complained of technical failures. One scanner operator claimed to hear a quiet voice reading the Latin text through his headphones, even though the audio feed was muted. He later abandoned the work. Perhaps it's just a legend, or the result of one man's incredible labor. But if the book really wasn't written by the monk alone, then another question arises. For whom was it written? Because maybe it's not meant to be read, but to be observed. And every time you turn the page, it remembers. Not you. But the moment you began to believe its meaning was greater than words. And perhaps the demon on the page itself isn't the author, but the reader, who, one day, will see that you've reached the right place, and will cease to be an image. The silent city in Italy is Craco. In the southern part of Italy, in the Basilicata region, among hills and cliffs, stands the abandoned town of Craco. It seems carved out of the rock, narrow streets, churches without bells, houses with tables and beds still standing, but empty. The town is abandoned, but not destroyed. And that's precisely what makes it so strange. Craco, founded in the 8th century, survived invasions, epidemics, and wars. But it didn't disappear. Until 1963, when its residents began leaving one by one. First because of landslides, then because of cracks in the buildings. But the real reason was deeper. People left not because the city was crumbling, but because it had become unlivable. Locals reported that objects in their houses would jingle at night, even though there was no wind. In some apartments, objects would shift, clocks would stop, and mirrors would cloud. One priest claimed to hear footsteps every night on the stairs leading to the unoccupied attic. He was transferred to another parish. Then the dreams began. People saw the same images. An empty square, a faceless man standing in the center. At some point, everyone decided it was time to leave. Not because of the landslide, but because the city no longer saw them, as if it had excluded them from itself. Architects who surveyed Craco in the 1980s noted that the street structure violated urban planning principles. The streets led nowhere. Some staircases ended in walls. And if you superimpose the city plan on a star map, the streets align with the outline of one of the ancient Greek constellations, now almost forgotten. There's also a strange phenomenon: oral silence. Equipment installed in the city center doesn't pick up echoes. Whispers are lost, voices aren't reflected. It's as if the place absorbs sound. One researcher described the sensation: you speak, and the world simply refuses to respond. Craco has become a filming location, but camera operators complain that equipment malfunctions in the city center. Cameras cut out, and microphones produce background noise. One director refused to continue filming after a recording captured a female voice speaking in Latin in one of the rooms, even though no one else was in the scene. The city is officially recognized as a historical monument, but no one returns. Not a single house is inhabited. Not a single business is open. Tourists come and go. Everyone says the same thing. There's nothing to see, but you want to leave immediately. Some believe Craco is more than just an abandoned city. It's a structure that has fulfilled its purpose. It was once inhabited. Now it's a memory that refuses to be revisited. Perhaps it preserves not traces of people, but a space where something once happened, and now must remain closed. And then Craco's silence isn't a consequence of destruction, but a choice of the place itself. To remain silent until someone asks the wrong question, or begins to hear footsteps on the stairs leading up, to a room where no one lives, but where someone is already standing. Seasons in Turkey. In southeastern Turkey, near the city of Midyat, lies a network of caves known locally as the Caves of Long Shadows. This is not a tourist attraction, but rather a tangled labyrinth of natural and artificial tunnels, most of which have never been fully explored. The first mentions of them date back to the pre-Assyrian period, but most archaeologists believe that the caves are much older than official dates suggest. Light here doesn't behave as usual. Even with lanterns or spotlights, shadows from objects lengthen and shift, as if obeying a different geometry than the light source. People who have descended inside have described how a shadow might appear in front of a person, rather than behind them. Sometimes shadows don't match the shape of an object, One archaeologist exploring the entrance hall noticed that his own shadow was reflected off the wall as a different silhouette, shorter and with outstretched arms. Some tunnels lead to dead ends, others loop, returning the traveler to the same place. But with differences. The stones are shifted, the patterns on the walls are changed, the same passage can lead to different sections. Inside, symbols resembling cuneiform, but unidentifiable, are carved into the walls. One recurring image is of a faceless man standing in an archway. In some corridors, the echo does not return. It is absorbed. It vanishes. In 1992, a group of speleologists conducted a 5-day expedition. One of the participants, a physicist from Ankara, recorded a decrease in air density, although the pressure remained unchanged. His report included the phrase, "It's not the absence of sound. It's the deafness of space." Some surveillance cameras recorded movement in the empty halls, as if someone were passing through the frame. Thermal imagers showed flashes of heat in the shape of a human body, but in areas off limits. One time, a heat silhouette appeared directly behind one researcher and disappeared when he turned around. No one else went down there, unaccompanied. According to one hypothesis, the caves may be part of an ancient system, created not for habitation, but for isolation. Perhaps they hid here from someone, or something. Or perhaps something was sealed away, and the labyrinth's architecture was not for convenience, but to confuse the space itself, preventing anyone from reaching the center. Locals claim to hear dull thuds, like footsteps coming from underground at night. One shepherd reported seeing a silhouette on the slope, casting a shadow but without a body. His dog ran away and never returned. And if the shadows in these caves move on their own, perhaps they're not about light, but about presence. And then you're not simply entering a cave. You're entering a place where your own form becomes a record, and everything you do is already written in shadows that don't duplicate. But remember, the real story of the bell ringer of Notre Dame. Almost everyone has heard of Hugo's novel about the hunchback Quasimodo, the bell ringer of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. But few know that 19th century archives contain evidence of a real bell ringer who lived in the cathedral's cellars. And this story is far darker than the literary image. In the second half of the 1830s, the plans of the architect Lassus, who was rebuilding the cathedral after the devastation of the Revolution, mention an unknown individual living on the building's premises. He was not on the staff and did not receive a salary. Yet every evening and morning the bells rang with precision, even if no workers entered the belfry. The monks and workers called him by different names: the Silent One, Old Shadow, Stone Step. He didn't speak. He never showed himself in the light. But they saw him, his hunched figure, his long arms, his hood. Some claimed his face was unnaturally elongated, as if time had distorted his features. Others said he cast no shadow as he moved past the candles. One carpenter abandoned the cathedral after he heard breathing directly above him while climbing the spiral staircase at night, but saw no one. Another claimed to have found an inscription on the wall. "He is not a man. He is a memory." In 1842, a group of students from the Sorbonne, inspired by Hugo's novel, decided to spend the night in the cathedral. The next morning, they were found unconscious at the entrance. One of them, waking up, repeated, "He was looking at me, but he was behind me." None of them ever returned to studying architectural history. After this, access to the upper levels of the bell tower was avoided. Several years later, restorers discovered a mummified body in a niche between the walls, wrapped in cloth and containing scraps of parchment. Inside were not books, but stones into which Latin phrases had been scratched. The translation of one of them reads, "The voice is not a sound. The voice is repetition." The body was transferred to the archives. His name, if he had one, was never established. But the bells continued to ring, even when the bell ringers left the cathedral, even when the mechanism was switched off. Today, Notre Dame is a tourist destination. But some employees claim that on particularly quiet evenings, they can hear someone climbing the stone stairs, slowly, with heavy steps. They say this is neither a memory nor a legend. It is someone who remains to keep the cathedral from falling silent. Not because he is alive, but because he is sound. And then the question isn't whether the bell ringer was a real person. The question is that he rang the bell not for the city, but so that someone else would hear. Not from outside, but from inside the wall. In cases of spontaneous human combustion. Spontaneous human combustion is one of the most frightening and difficult to explain phenomena. People burst into flames right before the eyes of onlookers, turning to ashes in a matter of minutes, while surrounding objects, furniture, clothing, even nearby paper, remain virtually untouched. There are no traces of flammable substances on the body, and most importantly, there is no source of fire. Everything happens suddenly without cause, and without a trace of arson. The first recorded case dates back to the 17th century, but reports of such incidents continue to emerge in the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1951 in Florida. In the apartment, they discovered that the plastic objects around the victim had not melted. Only a greasy shadow remained on the floor. The forensic team was baffled. In another case, in London in 1982, a man suddenly burst into flames in the middle of the street, according to witnesses, as if from within. He tried to extinguish the flames, but they didn't come from his clothes, but seemed to ignite from within his body. He died at the scene. The autopsy found no traces of gasoline or kerosene. His liver and organs were destroyed by the high temperature, but his shirt was intact. Modern explanations range from rare metabolic reactions to the candle effect, where body fat can supposedly burn like a wick under certain circumstances. But in most cases, the conditions for this weren't there. The combustion temperature was too high. The combustion rate defied physics, and most importantly, people caught fire without a spark. Some researchers suggest that the phenomenon may be caused not by an external influence, but by a malfunction in the body's electromagnetic system. The human body contains electrical currents. During extreme disturbances, a local field may form that can resonate with an external source, for example, a radio signal or microwave. However, this theory remains speculative. There are reports that in some cases, before spontaneous combustion, people complained of headaches, ringing in the ears, and a sharp drop in blood pressure. This could indicate a neurophysiological trigger, as if the body itself were initiating a self-destruct process. The question is, why? Alternative theories assert that spontaneous combustion is not a mistake, but a process of exit, perhaps even a departure from the physical world. That flame is not destruction, but a form of transformation. Not death, but a transition. And if even one such story is true, then we're dealing not just with an inexplicable death, but with the moment when a person becomes a flame, not metaphorically, but literally, when life doesn't end, but flares up. And in this flare-up lies not pain, but a return. Some mysteries are being solved, others are lost forever. But there are those who continue to live alongside us like a parallel fabric folded beneath our very steps. We sense them, in a strange shadow on the wall, in a sudden silence behind us, in a sound that seems to have been heard only in our heads. These are not coincidences. These are not myths. This is something that has not disappeared. It just no longer speaks out loud. 72 stories, from different countries, eras, cultures, unrelated, and yet too similar to be random. Some erased, some cut out, some left, waiting for someone to start listening differently, not with their eyes, not with instruments, but with an attention that recognizes not the meaning, but the silence between the words. Because the real mystery isn't what happened. It's why we continue to feel like it's not over yet.